Chapter 1. The Dream of Anarchy. With the intertwined French and industrial revolutions, Western society embarked on a series of social upheavals and armed conflicts that have engulfed the entire planet. The inception of this revolutionary epoch took place when the Renaissance and the Reformation swept most of Europe. The first signs of masculine rebellion against medieval concessions to the feminine idea. The Reformation broke the medieval mold by laying the major stress on man as an individual rather than as a member of a social organism. It also laid upon him a heavy burden of personal responsibility, stripped of all the consoling symbolism of Mariolatry. In its reckless demythologizing, the Reformation, with its spiritual offspring, the 18th century Enlightenment, proved to be a fundamentally virile manifestation. From the early conquistadors and scientific discoverers of the secrets of nature to the latter-day explorers and great business entrepreneurs, it stamped the imprint of Western civilization on the whole world. Western man had listened to the rhythm of nature and applied his logic to the elaboration of a steely web of mathematical laws. He was prodded on toward the discovery of mastery of the physical world by his inborn Promethean urge. From the simple use of nature's available forces, he shifted to the creation of the machine, an independent cosmos that became the materialization of his mathematical dream. It was an animated universe in miniature made by man's creative genius out of inorganic matter, the concrete manifestation of the Logos Spermaticos. With this new world at his command, and his power increased tremendously, Western man hurled the machine at the rest of the world, smashing and destroying other civilizations. Domination over the forces of nature went hand in hand with political domination. With unlimited vigor, Western man threw immense networks of railroads and steamship lines over the world. With levers and screws, he fastened his grip on every corner of the globe, holding Mother Earth in tight bondage. Never had the masculine logos seemed so potent, and never had the devaluation of the specifically female function been so pronounced. But times change and potentials exhaust themselves when they become actual. Protestantism, especially its Puritan offshoot, generated capitalism, industrialism, and mechanism. It spent its initial religious impulse in concrete accomplishments and began to shift toward an ethical materialism concealed behind the outworn religious forms of Victorianism. Finally, it generated its antithesis, world revolution, a violent upsurge that has spread from its small geographical nucleus in Western Europe to the whole world. Revolution. In a spirit that is as masculine as the Western capitalist society, it is attempting to overthrow. In the process, woman, whose increasing dissatisfaction and social rebellion becomes one of the major dissolvents of contemporary Western society, becomes deeply involved. Today, we are reenacting, on a much larger scale, the social drama that from Euripides on shook the Greco-Roman world to its foundations, and eventually destroyed its civilization from within before the barbarians invaded the empire from without. The Euripides of the West was undoubtedly Henrik Ibsen, who, of all modern playwrights, comes closest to the pattern of classical Greek playwriting, especially in pure tragedy, where the sense of implacable destiny predominates. Susanna Thorisson, Ibsen's forceful wife, stiffened his weak backbone and gave him the strength of character he lacked. She probably enhanced his pro-feminist views. Like his Greek predecessor, Ibsen set out to shatter, not myths and mythology. Western society had by then largely metamorphosed them into ideals and ideologies, but all the traditional preconceived ideals set up by bourgeois society. To achieve this, Ibsenism used the emancipation of woman as a battering ram with which to knock down the Victorian fortress of respectability. The liberation of woman from the concept of duty to an ideal would also liberate the man. Any typical Ibsen play transmogrifies the impeccably conventional idealist, good, pure, strong, and brave, into a subtle villain, while his female heroines are, from a Victorian standpoint, typically unfeminine. In one of his early dramatic poems, Brand, he shows us an idealistic priest whose very saintliness, admired and worshipped by the crowd, destroys his wife and child, and causes more intense suffering to others than a half-dozen devils. In A Doll's House, he really comes to grips with the problem of woman, although he did not intend to depict Nora as a feminist. From the viewpoint of bourgeois morality, his idealistic Torvald is beyond reproach. In point of fact, From a purely human viewpoint, he is a coarse, selfish, and cowardly husband. Ibsen's main theme here is the struggle between society and the individual's private right to live and love. In describing a woman's tragic destiny, Ibsen relied on the idea that woman takes a more personal view of life than man, who is forever abstracting and generalizing. His main target is Torvald's view that a sin against society is more serious than the destruction of love, a view Ibsen abhorred. Ibsen's was the individualistic anarchistic outlook, which is the other side of the same coin, the feminine, personal, anti-ethical outlook. For Ibsen admirers who thought Nora should have become reconciled to duty instead of abandoning home and hearth. He next produced Ghosts, a ferocious attack on marriage as a totally useless sacrifice for all concerned. Alving, the idealistic non-hero, is a sensuous man whose dutiful wife drives him to spend most of his time in the arms of a housemaid. No Nora. Mrs. Alving decides to remain with husband and child, although this implies soul-destroying concealment. She sends her son abroad, fearing that his ideals might collapse as he grows older and finds out the truth. Finally, after years of sorrow, she is freed by the death of her husband. His reputation, thanks to her deceit, is that of a thoroughly honorable gentleman. Now comes the bitter reward for years of martyrdom. The son comes home, and being his father's son, starts to behave like the deceased. The tragedy is that, while she never loved her husband, they had made a marriage of convenience, very much like Ibsen's own matrimonial arrangement. She adores her son. She realizes she has no right to sacrifice him to the ideals that ruined her own life. But these ideals take their dramatic toll, having indirectly compelled the father to lead a sordidly secretive love life. She learns that the son has inherited the disease that such a way of life often breeds, and that, forewarned, he carries poison with which to destroy himself when he becomes insane. The play ends in an intensely tragic scene wherein the mother dispatches her mad son to the netherworld with her own hands. Victorian audiences were stunned and outraged by this powerful onslaught on all standard ideals, and a great deal of the message was lost in the sheer amount of vituperation thrown at it. A publication called Truth flung the following epithets at Ibsen's masterpiece: the sexless, terror, wonder, natural, the unwomanly woman, the unsexed females, the whole army of unprepossessing cranks in petticoats. Why? Wow. Effeminate men and male women. Naus. A wave of human folly. Obviously, Ibsen had pricked a raw social nerve not only in English-speaking nations, but in his native Norway. But he went even further. In Hedda Gabler, he depicts a frigid woman incapable of love, and therefore a castrating type who transcends the mere war of the sexes, and who, bored to death, deprived of idealism, and unencumbered with the concept of duty to God or others, is left only with that of duty to herself. Unable to discover what this consists of, she makes an ideal of vice. She ends by destroying herself. Hedda is a true reincarnation of Euripides' Medea. Undismayed by the mounting criticism, Ibsen went on doggedly. In When We Dead Awaken, his last play, he left a literary legacy to feminism that no other writer has provided before or since, one with such insight and power that it raises the problem of the meaning of civilization itself, in the form of a devastating indictment. Basically, the play contrasts two couples, one made up of a cultured and refined pair of human beings at the height of Western culture, the other, basically primitive, from the exclusively sports-minded, hunting crowd. The question asked, and to which the play replies in the affirmative, is whether primitive men and women enjoy a more fruitful and humane relationship, in which she fully shares the joys and passions, than a highly cultured modern couple in which the woman's soul is degraded, sucked dry to stimulate man's creative genius, and then wasted and thrown away. In the play, the sculptor Rubek finds the beautiful model he was always looking for, enthralls her by telling her about his vision of the perfect statue. Grasping his inspiration, she poses for him and helps him in every way with utter devotion. The statue at last achieved, he callously indicates that he has no more use for her. She has been only a means to an end. She leaves him and becomes insane. Soon enough, Rubek marries a totally unsuitable primitive woman, who nevertheless influences him sufficiently so that he no longer sees the perfection of his statue, which he now proceeds to alter and gradually destroy as a work of art, reshaping it into a monstrosity that satisfies the public's taste and makes him famous. Rubek eventually loses his wife to a more suitable primitive man who makes her happy. His former model, cured of her insanity, comes back into his life, seeing that for all the harm he had done her, he had actually crippled himself. She comes to believe that a miracle can undo the damage, that indeed the dead can awaken if and when the two sexes can work out a relationship in which they do not sacrifice and destroy each other. But, ascending an allegorical mountain where they meet the primitive couple, they climb up to their figurative death while the caveman saves his primitive woman. This work, which Ibsen viewed as an epilogue, appeared symbolically in the last days of December 1899. At the close of the century which it could aptly terminate, in the words of its antihero, "When we dead awaken, we shall see that we have not lived." The incisive power of Ibsen's work springs from the fact that his human creations are more real than real people, as if his surgical eye could see right through the innermost recesses of their souls and the structures of their personalities. His profundity shows in his portrayal the ambiguities and impenetrabilities of life. Out of the mists of the far north came the most penetrating dramatist since Shakespeare, a Scandinavian poet who stated through his mouthpiece, the skald Jatger and the pretenders, no song is born in full daylight. This massive interpenetration of symbolism and realism is both believable and far more striking than any concrete reality. A miraculous display of logical irrationality that could delineate the spiritual and psychological complexities of both sexes as no other writer ever could. True to life, Ibsen bulldozed all the artificial Victorian ideals and conventions out of his way, and was labeled immoral for so doing. GPT. No one in the English-speaking world was as consistently a feminist as Bernard Shaw. He also used the theme of the emancipation of woman to attack the Victorian edifice he abhorred. Even more than Ibsen's, Shaw's plays resemble Euripides in their dissolution of the stern dramatic form into psychology and philosophy, accompanied by essays or prefaces on any number of topics, especially feminism. Like Ibsen, Shaw, in his own words, was on the side of the prophets in having devoted himself to showing that the spirit or will of man is constantly outgrowing the ideals, and that therefore thoughtless conformity to them is constantly producing results no less tragic than those which follow thoughtless violation of them. But Shaw's wit proved more immediately effective than Ibsen's somber and tragic genius. Society will always laugh itself to destruction if its demise is presented to it with adequate humor. It seems that, once again, as in the Middle Ages when man used woman as a means to his own spiritual salvation, modern man was using woman as a convenient revolutionary tool to smash a social structure whose ideological underpinnings were becoming intolerable. Victorian conventionality was smothering the need for freedom of evolution, which justifies the need for toleration. Along with Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Ibsen, and Strindberg, Shaw wanted to strip away the artificial straitjacket of Victorian moralistic conformity. But with Ibsen, and unlike Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Strindberg, Shaw believed that the easiest, most convenient way to do so was to produce a social nuclear explosion by liberating the imprisoned female energy, instead of isolating it as Strindberg would have it. The sum of the matter is that, unless woman repudiates her womanliness, her duty to her husband, to her children, to society, to the law, and to everyone but herself, she cannot emancipate herself. But her duty to herself is no duty at all. Since a debt is cancelled when the debtor and creditor are the same person, its payment is simply a fulfillment of the individual will, upon which all duty is a restriction, founded on the conception of the will as naturally malign and devilish. Therefore, woman has to repudiate duty altogether. In that repudiation lies her freedom. For it is false to say that woman is now directly the slave of man, she is the immediate slave of duty. And as man's path to freedom is strewn with the wreckage of the duties and ideals he has trampled on, so is hers. A whole basketful of ideals of the most sacred quality will be smashed by the achievement of equality for women and men. The destroyer of ideals, though denounced as an enemy of society, is in fact sweeping the world clear of lies. In Strindberg's plays, man is displayed as the victim of married life, and the woman as the tyrannical soul-destroyer. Shaw sees in the emasculating woman only the twisted result of man's own behavior. Strindberg was a woman-hater who attempted to arouse men out of their slothful idealization of the female sex, which, to him, was but the hypocritical rationalization of their sensual impulses. His tragic inability to establish a meaningful relationship with his wives darkened his outlook on woman, and gave his work the quality of a mirror image of Ibsen's, for whom the absolute and final tragedy was the denial or destruction of love, usually sacrificed on the altar of social necessity. Both Ibsen and Strindberg were spokesmen of individualism, and it is in its name that they invade, against the increasingly oppressive weight of a complex social structure. Long before Bernard Shaw decided to encapsulate Ibsen's message in comic form, George Meredith had used his comic talent to describe the double war between the generations and the sexes, two conflicts that are, in reality, one. Woman, the true procreator of the species, always upholds the young against the old, if free to do so. Meredith was one of the first modern male writers who depicted women of intelligence and character, in The Egoist, who were the equals, in most respects, of men. But Shaw conveyed the message most convincingly, although not without an ulterior purpose in mind, to expound, after Schopenhauer, the primacy of will over reason. Here, again, woman is used to condemn the tyranny of utter rationalism. Shaw believed that woman, when willing to follow her impulse and instincts rather than ratiocinate, demonstrates conclusively the limitations of mere logic and the primacy of the will. Shaw stood in no need of Ibsen to formulate his views on womanhood, and his influence in the English-speaking world made itself felt more quickly, directly, and forcefully. Shaw's outlook can be summed up succinctly. The root of the war between the sexes is the masculine idealization of woman's self-surrender in love. He points out that the infatuation of passionate sexual desire repels even the object of that infatuation, and that love loses its charm when it is compelled, either by custom, law, or mere sensuality. The desire to give inspires no affection unless there is also the power to withhold. Thus, contemporary marriage, with all its legal compulsions, is wrong, and is doomed to disappear as the responsibility for the maintenance and education of the rising generation is shifted from the parent to the community. Fortunately, Shaw, unlike Jean-Jacques Rousseau, never had any children of his own, with which to experiment. Nevertheless, marriage, in all its degrading aspects, remained a pillar of the social structure in which woman was imprisoned. This being so, it is not surprising that our society, being directly dominated by men, comes to regard woman not as an end in herself like man, but solely as a means of ministering to his appetite, a sex object. This was untrue in former centuries when the religious outlook did not allow man to look upon himself as an end, but rather as a means with which to glorify God and the universe he created. In that case, both men and women found themselves to be respective means in the higher metaphysical sense, establishing a cooperative equality and a spiritual integration of sorts between the sexes. The collapse of the all-pervading religious outlook made man an end in himself, but having substituted for the Almighty, he now looked upon woman as a means to his own enjoyment rather than a fellow human being engaged in the same earthly pilgrimage toward mutual spiritual salvation. The metaphysical equality and partnership of former times were destroyed. The rebellion of woman became an inevitable consequence of this new state of mind. As Shaw put it, to treat a person as a means instead of an end is to deny that person's right to live, and to be treated as a means to such an end as sexual intercourse with those who deny one's right to live is insufferable to any human being. This, of course, presupposing that most women in those late Victorian days found no erotic enjoyment of their own in sexual intercourse. Woman, if she dares face the fact that she is being so treated, must either loathe herself or else rebel. Does she then loathe herself? By no means. She deceives herself in the idealist fashion by denying that the love which her suitor offers her is tainted with sexual appetite at all. When disillusionment sets in, the self-respect she has lost as a wife she regains as a mother, in which capacity her use and importance to the community compare favorably with those of most men of business. But this redeeming role depends entirely on the greater or lesser natural vocation she may have for a purely domestic life. The domestic career is no more natural to all women than the military career is natural to all men. If we have come to think that the nursery and the kitchen are the natural sphere of a woman, we have done so exactly as English children come to think of a cage as the natural sphere of a parrot, because they have never seen one anywhere else. No. These were almost revolutionary views when Shaw propounded them, although many have become commonplace. But revolutionary social change was precisely what Shaw was aiming at, and the emancipation of woman was largely a means to an end, pointing toward man's repudiation of duty by way of woman's. Shaw's revolution, however, was not so much socialistic as a purely individualistic rebellion in a Nietzschean or Schopenhauerian sense. The ultimate good was not the perfect society, but that particular social organization that allowed maximum freedom of expression and individual development to all human beings. This is essentially libertarian thinking, the intellectual foundation of anarchism. Libertarian thinking has an old ancestry, and is always connected with an instinctive feminine revolt against an outdated authority, and therefore against all authority and artificial moral constraints, usually unfettered by intellectual dogmatism. Woman goes to extremes once her traditional moorings have broken loose, sensing intuitively that she will never really be able to wrest public power from the hands of man. Woman's thinking along revolutionary lines always ends in some form of utopian anarchism, aiming at the total destruction of power, pure and simple, as early as the late Middle Ages. For example, with the Church's traditional authority greatly eroded, religious sects like the Anabaptists expounded similar libertarian views. In the 13th century, groups of mystical women, inspired by ecstatic visions, gathered together spontaneously and formed convents. They soon became known as Beguines, the famous sisters of the free spirit. Before long, they were joined by male beghards and celebrated orgies of pantheistic mysticism followed. They were all thoroughgoing anarchists, claiming total freedom for all individuals, inasmuch as God dwells in each individual soul, and therefore the individual will of each was the will of the Almighty. In their preaching, the brethren and sisters of the free spirit advocated outright collectivism, community of goods, personal equality, and the destruction of any kind of authority, the modern libertarian program of Bakunin and Kropotkin and Toto, except for the acknowledgement of the Almighty. What is remarkable here is that this movement was started spontaneously by women, which is actually not so remarkable insofar as females usually start great historical trends, even when they are formulated and led by males. Man, in his one-sided intellectualism, is far more a self-contained, autonomous, and well-defined entity, often the prisoner of his intellectual framework. Women usually appear to have an intuitive flair for the secret germination of new trends that are going to shape the future. An uncanny telepathic sense for the forthcoming, that is the natural counterpart of their basic conservatism. They are far more plastic and adaptable and flexible than men, closer to ever-changing nature. So it was with the medieval libertarian sisters of the free spirit. And so it was on the threshold of the age of revolution with their lay descendants. Not by chance. Bernard Shaw was in a direct line of intellectual descent from William Godwin, the first articulate exponent of the anarchist credo, and often better remembered as the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, the first outspoken feminist. This odd couple jointly ministered to the birth of both libertarian and feminist thinking, symbolizing in the flesh the obscure but close relationship between the two trends. Only a year after Mary Wollstonecraft published her Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, her future husband's startling work, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, appeared, a striking philosophico-political study. It set forth all the arguments in favor of anarchism, rejection of any kind of social organization dependent upon government and of all authority, in favor of an utterly decentralized social organism founded upon a voluntary sharing of material goods on a plane of complete equality. Anarchy awakens mind, diffuses energy and enterprise through the community, though it does not affect this in the best manner. But in despotism, mind is trampled into an equality of the most odious sort. Everything that promises greatness is destined to fall under the exterminating hand of suspicion and envy. Actually, Godwin refused to call himself an anarchist in order to divorce himself from the negative anarchists of the contemporary French Revolution. But in essence, he was an anarchist of the Bakunin type, prefiguring the libertarian trend of the following centuries. While he refused to go as far as to trust the presumed innate goodness of the uneducated people's spontaneous instincts, he believed that only education could truly free the individual. He anticipated anarchism's rejection of government, and its vision of society as a naturally developing organism in need of neither authority nor coercion. This seminal ancestor was no believer in force or violence, and stated emphatically that revolutions, instead of being truly beneficial to mankind, answer no other purpose than that of marring the salutary and uninterrupted progress which might be expected to attend upon political truth and social improvement. Unlike some believers in violence, most of the leading theoreticians of libertarian revolution shared Godwin's peaceful views and followed in his intellectual footsteps. In his day, Godwin's popularity and influence were enormous. In Hazlitt's words, William Godwin blazed in the firmament of reputation. His doctrine later filled with enthusiasm generations of romantic poets, from Coleridge to Shelley. The idea that both society and government exist solely for the convenience of the individual, without any valid claims or rights of their own, was novel in those days. Godwin's originality was to break away from Locke's and Rousseau's concept of a basic social contract as a foundation of political justice because of its binding, legalistic nature, which prevents the full flowering of the individual's exercise of private judgment and instinctive commitment to truth and justice. The fact that the founders of anarchism and feminism became husband and wife is, again, highly symbolic. In an intellectual sense, Godwin's message inspired many latter-day male thinkers who were wholeheartedly in favor of feminism. Its influence can be traced easily in Oscar Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism and H.G. Wells' Men Like Gods. In Back to Methuselah, Bernard Shaw treated a Godwinian theme. In his study on Ibsen, Shaw pointed out with greater acuteness than anyone else the revolutionary impact of the anarchistic individualistic trend as compared with socialism of the Marxist type. In a noteworthy paragraph, Shaw explains the paradoxical irony of the Victorian outlook on socialism. The credit of our domestic ideals having been shaken to their foundations, as through a couple of earthquake shocks, by Ibsen and Strindberg, the arch-individualists of the 19th century, whilst the socialists have been idealizing, sentimentalizing, denouncing capitalism for sacrificing love and homeland, domestic happiness and children and duty to money, greed and ambition. Yet it remains a commonplace of political journalism to assume that socialism is the deadliest enemy of the domestic ideals and unsocialism, their only hope and refuge. In the same breath, the world-grasping, commercial synthesis we call capitalism, built up by generations of Scotch rationalists and English utilitarians, atheists, agnostics and natural selectionists, with Malthus as the one churchman among all its prophets, is proclaimed the bulwark of the Christian churches. Time has proved Shaw correct, and proved socialism, Marxist or otherwise, essentially conservative in its attitude towards social duty, morality, marriage, domestic life, and the traditional relationship between the sexes. With Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Godwin's intellectual successor, the anarchistic strain becomes evident. Proudhon was a strong super-individualist who stood in lonely pride, spurned parties and political sects, and set such store by individual freedom that even a mild expression such as association was suspect in his eyes. He viewed the individual as the ultimate concern, but conceded that the individual's personality had to be shaped by, and find fulfillment in, society. In other words, society was not the individual's enemy, but the inevitable matrix within which the individual's personality could temper itself and find its true function. Proudhon's impact on 19th century thought was enormous, in fact, second only to Marx. From Baudelaire and Flaubert to Sainte-Beuve and Victor Hugo, most writers of the century who were interested in social matters fell under his spell. Even Tolstoy borrowed not only his greatest novel's title from Proudhon's La Guerre et la Paix, which means war and peace, but also many of his views. Famous for having coined the greatest slogan of the century when, in answer to the question title of his first work, What is Property?, he concluded, "Property is theft." This dynamic revolutionary was also one of the leading anti-feminists of the century. Proudhon's attitude toward woman illustrates one of the paradoxes of the individualistic anarchistic trend. Inasmuch as man is already by nature more individualized, even embryologically, than woman. Any added emphasis put on individualism will strengthen his masculine character, and that of any society which emphasizes and encourages individualism. Like many arch-individualists and anarchists after him, Proudhon appeared to set more store by the actual struggle than by the ultimate victory, by the means than by the end, as if it was in the crucible of conflict that the individual forged his personality and achieved true personal freedom. In this almost joyful acceptance of tension and stress as inevitable, the virile side of anarchism stands out in bold relief. And yet, in its anti-systematic and anti-intellectual approach, and in its refusal to set up a consistent doctrine, in its shunning of an intellectual paraphernalia and its reliance on instinctive behavior, its feminine side betrays itself. In his last letter to Karl Marx, which was to break up their relationship, Proudhon stated defiantly, "I make profession in public of an almost absolute economic anti-dogmatism. Let us give the world the example of a learned and far-sighted tolerance. But let us not, because we are at the head of a movement, make ourselves the leaders of a new intolerance. Let us not pose as the apostles of a new religion, even if it be the religion of logic, the religion of reason. Let us gather together and encourage all protests. Let us brand all exclusiveness, all mysticism. There could be no meeting of the minds between them." This strong, solitary revolutionary, however, did not look upon woman as a companion and fellow worker in the cause, but as an inferior being, physiologically condemned to home and kitchen, and to ultimate dependence on the strong male, for whom the true woman was the devoted housewife and mother, and the rest harlots and prostitutes. There was in him an ascetic strain similar to that of the early Buddhist or Christian saints, in particular in his elimination of love from marriage because it destroys the love of work, cripples domestic respect, and harms the performance of social duty. The historian Michelet, who was at all times under the spell of women, attacked Proudhon on this point and stated that he disagreed with his view that woman was only receptive. She was also productive through her influence on man, although he admits that, by herself, she is largely uncreative. Proudhon appears to have been an exception in his attitude toward woman. As far as his anarchist successors were concerned, equality of the sexes was taken for granted, but their libertarian views were also slightly different. For the greatest anarchist, Michael Bakunin, the absolute individualism of Proudhon had to give way to free associations. What for Proudhon had been a reluctant concession to necessity, a mere means of coping with fast increasing industrialization, became for Bakunin the pivot of all socioeconomic organization. It is the productive collectivity, the group of workers rather than the isolated individual, that becomes the cornerstone of a suitable economic structure. From here on, anarchism sloughs off the rigid individualism of its forebears to become a libertarian, anti-authoritarian collectivism. Bakunin lays stress on individual freedom, but not that kind of bourgeois freedom that springs from Rousseau's theory in Du Contrat Social, that vile book as he termed it. There never were entirely free individual men who joined together in order to create society. In fact, community existed before the individual, and the concept of freedom is unthinkable outside the community. Primacy belongs to the group. As he stated it, "I am only free when all human beings around me, men and women, are equally free. Other people's freedom, far from putting limits on or being the negation of, my freedom is, on the contrary, both necessary and the confirmation of it." Like all anarchists, Bakunin wanted to destroy the state, but he put far greater emphasis on society, the indispensable medium for the full flowering of the individual personality. And again, like most of his successors, Bakunin saw clearly the growing artificiality of life springing from the Industrial Revolution, and the bourgeois society issued from it. Everything good, customs, public opinion, is natural, perhaps the key word of the whole anarchist movement. The libertarian emphasis on destruction springs from this inner conviction that once the artificial barriers that separate men from one another are swept away, nothing will prevent wholesome social organisms from cropping up, just as his Spanish successors were to hark back, unconsciously, to the free quasi-independent communities that prevailed in medieval Spain. Bakunin undoubtedly had in mind the small peasant communities of Russia and the natural collectivism of the Mir. Similarly, his worthy successor, Peter Kropotkin, was to look back wistfully upon the medieval manor and guild, the Obscena and or tell. Basically, anarchism, then and today, was a reaction against the brutal excesses of industrialism, a longing for a simpler, if more austere way of life that prevailed in the non-industrial past. Anarchism did not want to deal with the masses as Marxists did, but with small groups and communities in which human rights, and even more important, human dignity, could really be protected. In anarchism one could find a true reincarnation of one aspect of medieval Christianity: its respect for the fundamental equality of all human souls in the eyes of the Lord. And now that the Lord was denied of all human beings, and the bitter violence with which anarchism turned anticlerical at times demonstrated its profound, quasi-religious conviction that the Christian churches had betrayed a sacred ideal. In the same vein is Bakunin's emphasis on the rejection of a priori ideas or preordained, preconceived laws in favor of his own emphasis on purely instinctive doctrines. Here again, a feminine attitude. His distrust of abstractions extended even to science, and he proclaimed a revolt of life against science. Or rather, against the rule of science, against Auguste Comte's positivism as well as against Marxists, the priests of science. Some of his successors, the Russian brothers Gordon, for instance, rejected both religion and science outright, the rule of heaven and the rule of nature, angels, spirits, devils, molecules, atoms, ether, the laws of God, heaven, and the laws of nature, forces, the influence of one body on another. All this is invented, formed, created by society. One important aspect of anarchism is its revolt, not only against scientific determinism and its implied threat to human freedom and autonomy, but also against the tremendous power that the full technology derived from it can accumulate in a very few hands. One reason for the persistence of anarchist tendencies today, masquerading under some of the new left labels, is that technological concentration has made some traditional forms of political and economic power almost unbearable. For the same reason, Bakunin profoundly distrusted the Marxist dictatorship of the proletariat, and affirmed that it would inevitably end in the rule of scientific intellect, the most autocratic, the most despotic, the most arrogant, and the most contemptuous of all regimes. He understood Marxism quite accurately, and was prophetic when he wrote, "According to the theory of Mr. Marx, the people must not destroy the state, but must strengthen it, and place it at the complete disposal of their benefactors, guardians and teachers, the leaders of the Communist Party, namely Mr. Marx and his friends, who will proceed to liberate mankind in their own way. On the contrary, power, all forms of power of man over man, must be destroyed." The general attitude of anarchism toward woman was a logical corollary of this outlook. In Spain, for instance, the first general gathering of the anarchistic Alianza de la Democracia Social in 1872 put at the head of its program: the alliance desires first of all the definite and complete abolition of classes, and economic and social equality of individuals of both sexes. It desires for the children of both sexes equality of education, of food, and social position. In other words, all anarchists echoed the brothers Gordon in advocating dynanthropism, the emancipation and humanization of woman. Unlike the Marxists, who emphasized doctrinal orthodoxy and dialectics, strict discipline, and the Jesuitical approach of sacrificing moral principles to expediency, the anarchists relied entirely on their spontaneous instincts. Like the Marxists, they hated the greed of the capitalists. But they hated even more the love of power displayed by most Marxists, especially the Soviet dictatorship in Russia. When the test came for anarchism, the Spanish Civil War, it was able to show its true mettle. Shocked by the hypocritical morals of Spain's bourgeoisie, the anarchists proceeded to apply their ideals to the concrete situation as it was evolving. Anarchism was not merely something to believe in, but something that had to be lived. Far from wishing to abolish the family, they wanted it to be based on love and on feelings of honorable reciprocity. The collectivist village communes that were set up in July 1936 in anarchist districts were administered by assemblies consisting of every able-bodied man and woman belonging to the working class, except for the inclusion of women. These were much like the medieval open council and town hall meetings of the communes of medieval Spain, as far as morals were concerned. Already in 1918, the anarchists of Andalusia neither smoked nor drank, opposed cock and bull fights, often favored naturism and vegetarianism, and stood for the protection of a slightly incongruous medley of women, children, old men, trees, and animals. Yet, atavism remained strong, especially in a country such as Spain. The Latins in general and Spaniards in particular have never had much use for the concept of sexual equality. When the revolutionary pinch came, they reverted to type. George Orwell, describing Barcelona under anarchist rule in the early days of the Spanish Civil War, tells us, "There were still women serving in the militias, though not very many. In the early battles they had fought side by side with the men as a matter of course. It is a thing that seems natural in times of revolution. Ideas were changing already. However, the militiamen had to be kept out of the riding school, while the women were drilling there because they laughed at the women and put them off. A few months earlier, no one would have seen anything comic in a woman handling a gun. Even though Pablo Picasso joined the French Commune after the Second World War, and had always displayed his left-wing views in political matters, he made no secret of the fact that, as far as he was concerned, there are only two kinds of women, goddesses and doormats. One of his faithful female companions adds that, whenever he thought I might feel too much like a goddess, he did his best to turn me into a doormat. Only a Spaniard such as Picasso, whatever his political persuasion, could claim that there's nothing so similar to one poodle dog as another poodle dog, and that goes for women too. In the last resort, anarchism displays its innermost femininity in its overall approach to life and behavior. The anarchist wants to be, whereas the communist wants to do and from. All times woman has placed greater emphasis on being and man on doing, on proving that he differs from the females that nursed him into life. At heart, and except for the anarcho-syndicalists, anarchism was essentially a retrograde movement, a more or less unconscious desire to return to a simpler, purer, and more natural past, which explains the far greater destructive element in its makeup than can be found in Marxism. In its nostalgia for the past, it sees destruction as inherently constructive. Paradoxically, violence will lead to the extinction of compulsion and to the rule of freedom. With the idea of the golden age of the past in his mind, an anarchist commented on the burning of Malaga during the Spanish Civil War in the following terms: "Yes, they are burning it down. And I tell you, not one stone will be left on another stone. No, not a plant nor even a cabbage will grow there, so that there may be no more wickedness in the world." Nestor Makhno, the formidable Ukrainian anarchist guerrilla leader, organized his rural communes in 1919 on the pattern of the Andalusian agricultural communes and handicraft cooperatives, but with the age-old examples of the Russian village commune and cooperative association in mind. He was essentially a town hater, an implacable enemy of urban civilization, longing for natural simplicity. This return to nature theme, whether played by Queen Marie Antoinette at the Petit Trianon or by 20th century anarchists in their communes, is basically feminine, an atavistic unwillingness to cope with the challenge presented by the Promethean development of contemporary civilization. Yet, from William Godwin to Peter Kropotkin, anarchist leaders always preached the virtues of scientific and technological progress in the belief that the machine would free the worker from drudgery and soul-destroying exhaustion. But, in the long run, no anarchist movement was ever able to reconcile two diametrically opposed views of life. In the end, the anarchist does not want to conquer power but to destroy it. Basically, woman in revolt adopts the same position, not so much out of innermost conviction as because she feels that she can never exert direct power for long before man wrests it away from her, except in the rare instances when an individual woman is born to it or inherits it from a close male relative. To sum up, the contemporary technological revolution has made the problem of raw power more acute than ever, and therefore will keep the issue of anarchism as a philosophy alive for the foreseeable future, in that it has immensely accentuated the accumulation of power in the hands of the contemporary bureaucratic structures that rule the world. Such ubiquitous power of investigation, control, manipulation, and destruction of other human beings is vested today in the hands of the most democratic government that it would dazzle Genghis Khan at the height of his power. This technologically induced concentration of power has made many aspects of its exercise almost intolerable in our contemporary world, and increased not only women's but many men's distrust of it. Chapter 2. Revolution in Action. The French Revolution. The first great social conflagration in the history of Western civilization and the prototype of many others, did nothing to improve the condition of women. The early revolutionary legislators were caught in a dilemma. Having abolished the limited female suffrage in the pre-revolutionary provincial and general estates, along with all other social privileges, they failed to follow through logically by setting up a universal suffrage because they were fundamentally afraid of women. Two females, in particular, scared them: the hated Austrian Queen Marie Antoinette and the fanatical Charlotte Corday, who assassinated revolutionary leader Marat. The great men of the Revolution, Mirabeau, Danton, and Robespierre, were anti-feminist to a man. Robespierre, in particular, the cold-blooded, tyrannical Puritan dictator, disliked women in general, and detested women of loose morals. Of course, the great intellectual precursor of the Revolution and political mentor of Robespierre was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose revolutionary egalitarianism was reserved for men and did not extend to women. All of them labored for the emancipation of man, not woman, whose delicate constitution, in the words of the lecherous Mirabeau, while perfectly suitable for the perpetuation of the species, restricts them to modest household chores and the sedentary inclination that this type of work requires. Yet, women did acquire equal rights in one respect: the right to have their heads chopped off like those of their male counterparts. From Queen Marie Antoinette and Madame du Barry to high-minded revolutionaries like Madame Roland and Lucille Desmoulins, they were all carted off in the dreaded tumbrils to have their delicate necks severed with a total lack of elementary courtesy. One can understand why the widow of the philosopher Condorcet, in reply to Bonaparte's stinging remark that he did not like women who meddled in politics, should complain that in a country where their heads are cut off, it was natural that they should want to know why. The irony was that many women had welcomed the revolution. On August 7, 1789, Parisian women generously poured all their jewelry into the patriotic gifts coffers. As Carlyle put it, unfortunate females give what they have amassed in loving, but the more they gave to the budding revolution, the less they received. Yet, without their active participation, there would have been no revolution at all. Spontaneous revolutions cannot take place without a deep-seated discontent among the rank and file of women, which usually manifests itself in the shape of female mobs taking matters into their own hands, with elemental power and determination, carving out a revolutionary path along which emboldened men eventually follow. In the first great riots in Paris, the bolder men joined the females, but cautiously disguised as women. Woman. Mother Earth is the ground man walks on, and when this naturally cautious, prudent, conservative element is shaken by uncontrollable anger, the effect on man is almost telluric, akin to a psychic earthquake. Female mobs can be terrifying, as they were in the French Revolution. As Carlyle painted it, your mob is a genuine outburst of nature, issuing from, or communicating with, the deepest deep of nature. Carlyle drew a remarkable picture of these enraged crowds that swept into the Hôtel de Ville of Paris before surging on as a tidal wave toward Versailles. A thought, or dim raw material of a thought, was fermenting all night, universally in the female head, and might explode in squalid garret. On Monday morning, maternity awakes to hear children weeping for bread. Maternity must forth to the streets. In one of the guardhouses of the Quartier Saint-Eustache, a young woman seizes a drum, for how shall National Guards give fire on women, on a young woman? The young woman seizes the drum, sets forth beating it, uttering cries relative to the dearth of grains. All women gather and go. Crowds storm all stairs, force out all women. No one has described with greater eloquence the irresistible power of women's revolt, born of hunger and outrage at social injustice, propelling the more timid and oratorical men into concrete revolutionary action. And so, like snowbreak from the mountains, for every staircase is a melted brook, it storms, tumultuous, wild shrilling towards the Hôtel de Ville. Grand it was, says Camille, to see so many Judiths, from 8 to 10,000 of them in all, rushing out to search into the root of the matter. Not unfrightful it must have been. Ludicro terrific, and most unmanageable. Cho! The National Guards form on the outer stairs with leveled bayonets. The 10,000 Judiths press up, resistless. The National Guard must do one of two things. Sweep the place de grève with cannon, or else open to right and left. They open. The living deluge rushes in, led by the famous red-clad Amazonian Théroigne de Riencourt. And knowing full well that the soldiers would hesitate to strike them, they sweep through the Hôtel de Ville, followed by the more timorous male rioters. Then, on to Versailles. Possessed by a particular hatred for a rival female, the Austrian queen, swearing that they will behead her, stick her head on a spear, and make cockades out of her guts. But when Lafayette appears on the balcony in order to save Marie Antoinette from the wild mob and bravely kisses her hand, a lightning change of mood takes place. The bold gesture is greeted with thunderous and tearful applause. Once the revolution was on. However, there was no stopping it until it had come full circle. Now fully controlled by the males. Once the female mobs had physically overthrown the remains of the ancient regime, the revolution showed its true colors in reply to the Royne's efforts to raise female battalions. In a striking article, the influential publication entitled Revolutions de Paris stated in February 1791, "Political freedom and civil rights are, so to speak, useless for women, and therefore must not be granted to them. Destined to spend their entire lives in their father's house or that of their husbands. Born in a condition of absolute dependence from birth to death, they have been endowed with only private virtues. A woman belongs only to her home and family. Of all that takes place outside, she is entitled to know only what her parents or her husband choose to tell her." To a more forceful demand on the part of feminists for equal rights, the revolutionary leaders replied by an increasingly vocal expression of their own anti-feminism. For Olympe de Gouges, the most representative feminist of the times, who wrote a Declaration of the Rights of Women, male revolutionaries had nothing but scorn when she moaned, "Oh, my poor sex! Oh, women who have in no way benefited from this revolution." But when Charlotte Corday assassinated the dreaded Marat, the left-wing revolutionaries, Montagnards, reacted with an anti-feminist violence born of atavistic fear. Olympe de Gouges tried in vain to explain that by slamming the door to power and prestige in women's face, male revolutionaries condemned them to open the door to crime. It was too late. On October 30, 1793, the all-powerful convention, the Revolutionary Legislative Assembly, closed all women's clubs and organizations, putting an end to any kind of organized feminist movement, just as it was getting into the full swing of the Grand Terror. A striking feature of the political slant of active feminism up to that time was its formal alliance with those left-wing revolutionaries, who advocated a thoroughgoing social, as well as political revolution. The Republicains revolutionaires struck up against Danton and Robespierre, an alliance with the extremist Club de Cordeliers, prompting their Girondin opponents to accuse them of being anarchists. On October 29, the eve of the suppression of all women's political organizations, Fabre d'Eglantine pointed out that these organizations were not made up of mothers, daughters, or sisters, but of adventuresses, emancipated girls, harlots, and female grenadiers. To which the convention replied with thunderous applause. The remarkable ugliness of the Republicains revolutionaires horrified many of these worthies, and a police commissioner pointed out that the Jacobins were fools to have enlisted the support of such strikingly repulsive women in defense of the revolution. Napoleon nailed woman's inferior social status in his enduring legal code, even though, at one point, he had to appeal to French women's assistance to get one of his most unpopular measures through, the signing of a concordat with the Pope, a step that even some of his most trusted and loyal military companions criticized violently. Napoleon's genius had promptly understood what generations of forthcoming socialists would, in their turn, meditate upon. In the end, the French Revolution was defeated by the women's obstinate resistance, because it had neglected to take them into account. The basically religious and conservative outlook of the bulk of France's female population could not be overcome. And on that stubborn obstacle, the French Revolution eventually foundered. In his work, La Femme, the historian Michelet relates the revealing outburst of a young Frenchman, French women are brought up to hate and despise what all Frenchmen love and believe in. Twice French women embraced, then abandoned and killed revolution, once in the 16th century when it was a matter of freedom of conscience, then again at the end of the 18th century when political freedom was concerned. They are chained to the past, without knowing too much about it. In order to be successful, forthcoming revolutions would have to enlist women's support or be doomed to failure, even on tactical grounds. The presence of numerous women was advisable, inasmuch as it prevented police or armed forces from handling crowds too brutal, as was made symbolically evident when they stormed the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. This point was not lost on socialist leaders in many countries. The man who best understood this truth was the German socialist August Bebel, who shook a whole generation of patriarchally minded German workers by insisting that feminism was not a mere whim of spoiled bourgeois women, but a profound historical necessity if social democracy was ever to succeed. Most of his fellow socialists derided his pro-feminist views, some with outright anger. But with the publication of his Die Frau und der Sozialismus, whose opening sentence reads, "From the beginning of time oppression has been the common lot of woman and the laboring man," he eventually won over to his side most of his colleagues, many of them undoubtedly moved by the pragmatic view that Bebel summarized by stating, in a speech to the Reichstag, that victory will lie wherever woman takes a stand in the great social movement. No. This idea does not seem to have struck Karl Marx very forcibly. One searches in vain in his monumental Das Kapital for references to a specifically feminist problem. Once in a while, he will mention women along with child labor in order to make a point, and will comment upon the fact that woman's true qualities are warped to her disadvantage, and all the moral and delicate elements in her nature become the means for enslaving her and making her suffer. But the true Marxist villain is capitalism, not patriarchalism or masculine privileges. God knows that Marx owed everything, except his talent, to his brave and self-sacrificing wife, Jenny von Westphalen, an aristocratic heiress who gave up wealth and social position out of love for the Moor, as he was known to his intimates. He himself acknowledged that it was her determination that clinched their marriage. "My fiancée has fought for me the most bitter fights, fights which have almost undermined her health, against her pietistic, aristocratic relatives, to whom the Lord in heaven and the Lord in Berlin are alike objects of worship. Her reward was a life of misery and suffering, which she endured because of her love for him." Yet, when he began to expound his materialistic theories to her, she expressed typically feminine doubts as to the real value of philosophic systems in general, and his in particular, as well as apprehension of his inclination toward extremism. To his claim that economics was the exclusive cause of everything, she could only wonder, for what economic reasons had she married him? Obviously, one must be motivated not by economic reasons alone. She had long believed that revolutionary philosophers truly wanted to enthrone reason and science in place of myths and superstition. Now she slowly discovered that, in typical masculine self-deception, they were in the process of creating a new form of mythology, a metaphysical ideology masquerading in the guise of a materialistic scientific socialism. Her feminine realism saw through the sham performance and its probable consequences. But she smiled at the prospect with a tender, good-humored irony. That was his affair. She had married him, not his philosophy. No. Friedrich Engels, rather than Marx, is the one who looked deeper into the problem of woman and developed a comprehensive theory of the origin of the family, based unfortunately for his theory on the now outdated speculations of the anthropologist Louis H. Morgan, who claimed that the monogamic family was a late development, preceded by the Sib-Bitois. From these false premises, Engels' imagination took its flight and wove a theory centered around the idea that masculine and feminine characteristics were merely the result of capitalistic society. The savage capitalistic male had, at some point in the transition from matrilinear to patrilinear society, brought about the overthrow of mother right, which was the world historical defeat of the female sex. From this, Marx was led to conclude that the modern family contains in germ not only slavery, but it contains in miniature all the contradictions which later extend throughout society and its state. And he added, Social progress can be measured with precision by the social position of the female sex, which is why it is usually higher in the most primitive societies. As a result, they all chorus the same litanies. Marriage is sexual slavery, Bebel. Marriage differs from prostitution in that one is purchase and the other hire, Engels. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels took the bull by the horns. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical grow hot over this shameful intention of the communists. On what does the present bourgeois family rest? On capital. On private gain. It exists in its complete development only for the bourgeoisie, but it finds its complement in the proletariat's forced want of family life, and in public prostitution. The bourgeois ways of speaking about the family and education, about the sacred relation of parents and children, grow the more sickening, the more, in consequence of the progress of industry, all family bonds are torn asunder for the proletariat. The bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears that instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally cannot imagine but that women will share the same fate. He does not guess that this is the very problem: to abolish the position of women as mere instruments of production. Ironically, the bourgeois was doing just that, abolishing the position of women as mere instruments of production and, on the contrary, idling them and raising them up to be passive, non-working status symbols. But then, neither Marx nor Engels ever let facts stand in their way when they wanted to prove a doctrinal point. In fact, one should not take too seriously the sincerity of these apostles of revolution. The tactical advantage of marrying feminism and the cause of socialism was not lost on them. As one of them expressed it, "Let socialists espouse the emancipation of women, and women will be the foes of capitalism and devotees of socialism." This tactical policy paid off handsomely. If Jenny von Westphalen had married Karl Marx, the man, and not his philosophy, other women married Marxism without reservation. It was in the very Russia that Marx feared and despised that a woman, Vera Zasulich, founded the first Russian Marxist organization with Plekhanov and Axelrod, and it was in Russia, in 1917 Petrograd, that his brainchild came to violent birth as a concrete historical phenomenon, when women workers organized an all-female meeting at the Lesnoy textile plant to plan the inevitable insurrection. It sounds like a replay of the early stages of the French Revolution, when female mobs routed the National Guard. The Bolsheviks and other left-wing parties had condemned the forthcoming revolution in advance as doomed to inevitable failure. But never mind. The female workers took matters into their own hands. On March 8 tort 1117, women workers poured out of the textile factories of Petrograd and enlisted the assistance of male workers who had just been locked out of the Putilov plant. A few hours later, a powerful mob made up almost exclusively of women managed to break through police barriers and pour into the Nevsky Prospect, looting the bakeries. All the male left-wing political leaders were caught by surprise, and most of them rushed in to join the revolting crowds. On March 9th, the Mezhraionka, a social democratic organization dedicated to bringing together the feuding Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, and also the most influential with female workers, issued a call for a general strike. But it was the infuriated women who had started it all, and had given the men courage enough to defy the police and the Cossacks. Even then, however, the men who joined the crowds lacked leadership, since the revolutionary leaders themselves had not foreseen the power of the spontaneous female rising. In his exile in Zurich, Lenin remained skeptical for a long time. And even after the Tsar's formal abdication, he wrote to one of his women followers, Alexandra Kollontai, that no change of any great importance had taken place in Russia. It took the men a while to join the female-initiated movement. Having triggered the insurrection, Russian women workers then let the men take over the more brutal aspects of the unfolding revolution. But they remained active on both sides of the civil war. Female battalions defended the Winter Palace against the Bolsheviks, and women political leaders emerged, such as Maria Spiridonova, who led the left social revolutionaries in their attempt to block the dictatorial takeover by the Bolsheviks. If the Bolshevik takeover was finally successful, it was largely the result of the mass action of other revolutionary women, shaped and organized by the first conference of working and peasant women held in Moscow in November 1918. Women were enlisted for military service and actually took part in combat on numerous occasions. The repeal of the attacking White Guards at Lugansk was mostly women's work. The women of Petrograd played an important part in the repeal of General Udenich's White Army. Organized in regular battalions, women dug trenches, organized nursing corps, strung barbed wire on barricades, provided the famous stopping detachments, which turned deserters around and sent them back to the front. On this Petrograd front alone, over 1,500 women were killed, wounded, or captured. Women revolutionaries who stood apart from the crowd and became political leaders in their own right usually displayed typical feminine traits, a certain abhorrence for useless violence. Unless fired by some hysterical passion, Maria Spiridonova, killing General Luzhensky, and masterminding the assassination of the German ambassador, Count Mirbach, for instance. They displayed a taste for changes along evolutionary, rather than brutally revolutionary lines. Impatience with dogmatic hair-splitting and empty intellectualism, a lesser emphasis than men on political differentiation, and a greater one on the unifying basics of the revolutionary movement. They also focused their feminine intuition on personalities and on concrete issues: bread, shelter, fuel, peace, rather than abstract ones. At the 1907 International Congress, in Stuttgart. The great Rosa Luxemburg pointed out Lenin to Clara Zetkin, a fellow German communist leader. Have a good look at that man. That's Lenin. Observe his obstinate, self-willed skull. As Clara Zetkin stated later, Rosa was distinguished by her accurate artist's eye. When a nebulous peace conference was suggested at the 1907 Russian Party Congress in London, Rosa Luxemburg poured scorn on this suggestion of a platform for endless debates. At this conference, naturally, only a handful of fighting cocks living abroad would rival in, clamoring for the ear and soul of the German trustees, and to expect anything of these cocks is pure delusion. They are already so involved in quarrels and so embittered, that a general confab will merely give them an opportunity to unburden themselves of their oldest, and freshest insults. But when Soviet terror became an established and permanent feature of the new communist regime in Russia, under the leadership of the dreaded and dreadful Dzerzhinsky, she was profoundly indignant and protested. "Terror has not crushed us. How can you put your trust in terror?" And she exclaimed with anguish, "But how can Joseph Dzerzhinsky be so cruel?" Rosa Luxemburg was of Polish-Jewish extraction, naturalized German. Impatient with the bourgeois moderation of Germany's pre-war social democrats, she gathered around her the nucleus of the future Spartacus Bund, in which Clara Zetkin was entrusted with the organization of women followers. Rosa fought against the First World War tooth and nail, believing it to be fatal to the welfare of the European labor movement, in which she proved to be far less perceptive than Lenin, who correctly foresaw the unique opportunity afforded by this collapse of the old social order for decisive revolutionary change. Regardless of the shortcomings of her forecasts, Rosa remained both a true revolutionary and a humane one, who was soon horrified by the dictatorial grip of Soviet terror in Russia. Perhaps earlier than anyone, she saw what was coming and delineated the inevitable process. In place of the representative bodies created by general, popular elections, Lenin and Trotsky have laid down the Soviets as the only true representation of the laboring masses. But with the repression of political life in the land as a whole, life in the Soviets must also become more and more crippled. Without general elections, without unrestricted freedom of press and assembly, without a free struggle of opinion, life dies out, and every public institution becomes a mere semblance of life, in which only the bureaucracy remains as the active element. Such conditions must inevitably cause a brutalization of public life. This from the leading German communist, but a feminine one. At heart she was an anarchist who was too intelligent to believe that anarchism could work. Disregarding her merciless criticism, Lenin could not help remarking that, in spite of her mistakes, she was, and remains for us, an eagle. Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, male and female revolutionaries, the contentious, differentiating masculine doer, and the profoundly humane, instinctive, feminine being. Rosa, had she ever reached power, would have trusted the people. Lenin could not. Even Karl Kautsky, Rosa's German communist partner could not, and he agreed with Lenin that socialist consciousness is an element imported into the proletarian class struggle from outside. That is, from the usually male intellectuals who are the true revolutionary bacillus. In short, the proletariat is not so much a mass of impoverished and suffering humanity in need of uplift, but the inert raw material to be shaped and used unsparingly in the concrete realization of the intellectual's wildest dreams. No true woman could take that view. The typical self-alienation of modern man that Marxist thinkers blame on the capitalist mode of production is, in fact, a typically masculine phenomenon. The alienation man already feels as a child when he begins to realize that he must differentiate himself from the person closest to him, that is, in the nature of things, a woman. Where the little girl feels with utter certainty I am, and identifies with the mother. The boy comes to understand that he is not a female, and that he must struggle, with greater or lesser success towards self-identification. He must become. In that sense, ideological revolution comes easily to the masculine mind, but not to the feminine mentality, which can only be moved by specific, concrete grievances, but once moved, will not stop until the old order is destroyed. In another part of the world, in India, for example, it was largely the women who arose against the British Raj and signified in the early 1930s that its rule was eventually doomed. Jawaharlal Nehru was a witness to this. Our women came to the front and took charge of the struggle. Women had always been there, of course, but now there was an avalanche of them, which took not only the British government, but their own menfolk by surprise. Here were these women. Women of the upper or middle class, leading sheltered lives in their homes. Peasant women, working-class women, rich women, poorer women, pouring out in their tens of thousands in defiance of government order and police lathi. It was not only that display of courage and daring, but what was even more surprising was the organizational power they showed. As this instance exemplifies, along with the French, Russian, and other revolutions, all great revolutionary movements are triggered by earth-quaking shifts in women's feelings, when their natural conservatism shifts to indignation and desire for fundamental change, only to be promptly and invariably usurped by male leadership, which directs them into the Procrustean beds constructed beforehand by their intellectual doctrines. Chapter 3. The Communist Reality. Contemporary political ideologies are the psychological equivalents of the departed mythologies of former times. A myth can be defined by its connection with a temporal system. A myth always deals with past events, but events of such great symbolic importance that they have permanent validity and combine in one timeless whole, past, present, and future. A political or socioeconomic ideology can be seen under the same light, while historians deal with the dead. Irreversible past. Political ideologies see this past as having present and even future value, permanently efficient to the extent that it conditions and throws new light, however distorting, on present and future events. But the revolutionary nature of contemporary ideologies introduced some fundamental differences. The concept of revolution, in the modern sense of the word, is deeply rooted in the Zoroastrian, biblical, and Christian tradition. Revolutionary ideologies actually spring from the most uncompromisingly masculine trend of thought, which was launched by the Persians and the Hebrew prophets at the beginning of the Iron Age, and which put to flight the cyclical myths of the female-oriented Bronze Age. This led to the linear aspect of historical development, the eschatological view that there is a beginning and an end of the world, that the world will undergo a complete upheaval of revolutionary proportion, and that what matters is the final outcome of the process at the end of time, rather than the painful stages leading up to it. Hence, the revolutionary propensity to sacrifice the means to the end. In short, historical evolution moves from initial evil to final good, thanks to a long struggle between the powers of light and those of darkness, implying violence, and a long, patient, chiliastic waiting for the ultimate millennium. Even stripped of former religious transcendentalism, the ideological belief of Marxism betrays its uncompromisingly prophetic origins, as well as its apocalyptic vision, an imminent catastrophe ending, thanks to devastating ordeals in ultimate redemption, now viewed as the classless society and the mythical withering away of the state. Thus, In Marxism we have in concentrated and pseudoscientific form the masculine ideology that has been able to capitalize on the revolutionary discontent of modern womenfolk, provoked by the dislocation of traditional social structures and modes of living, and able to siphon its energy into the concrete actualization of its ideology. In reward, modern communism has granted women a new status, different from the bourgeois status inherited from the early days of the Industrial Revolution, a status modeled on that of the most successful and durable totalitarian state of antiquity, Sparta. In the Spartan model, man the citizen becomes a slave of the state, and so do woman and child. A rough equality of sorts is established between them, not because her status rises up to his, but because his sinks down to hers. They are both equal in their total subordination to the state. This is amply illustrated by the fate of women in the Spartan regimes established by the 20th century's great revolutions, the clearest indication of what the Spartan model implies. Outside a Marxist context is furnished by the brief experiment made in Germany under National Socialism. Contrary to widespread belief, Hitler had no intention of re-establishing the strong patriarchalism that would have stood as a protecting barrier between the individual and an all-powerful state. He did encourage women to turn themselves into procreating cows. In the racial interest of the German nation, how could he get a sufficient number of soldiers if the women did not produce? But he also attempted to destroy the autonomous family as effectively as Sparta did, enslaving both males and females as individuals in the overriding interest of the Third Reich. German women were no more repressed than the men, and, on the whole, were the most ardent admirers and supporters of National Socialism, an irrational and hysterical pseudo-romanticism. A wartime economy had to make full use of every ounce of energy that members of both sexes possessed, and no family considerations stood in the way. The same principle applies in every totalitarian state, whether reactionary or revolutionary, fascist or Marxist. Russia. On the other hand, was the first country to go through the Marxist-Leninist mill, and the specifically Russian relationship of the sexes, as historical tradition had shaped it, had some bearing on the course of the revolution itself. Until Peter the Great, Russian women were treated, by and large, very much as Muslim women. Locked up in their harem-like quarters, they had seen their social status and influence decline sharply since the old days preceding the Mongol invasions and their orientalization under the dominion of the Golden Horde. It was Peter the Great, the first Russian revolutionary, who abolished their seclusion, forced them to mingle with men in public, and take part openly in social life. This as a means to westernize his barbaric realm. The fact that Russia was spared the historical phases through which Western Europe had to proceed, Middle Ages, Renaissance, Reformation, made this improvement easier to achieve in spite of the fierce resistance of the boyars. The long succession of empresses who followed in Peter's footsteps promoted education for women, and in all respects attempted to train Russia's upper class to imitate the French pattern in its social relations between the sexes. However artificial this may have been, this steady upgrading of the Russian woman in the 18th century paved the way for the appearance of a new type of self-reliant female in the following century, a woman endowed with a strong personality and a spirit of initiative, rarely displayed in history. With the coming of the Decembrists and such dedicated women as Maria Volkonskaya, the movement for the emancipation of Russian females became part and parcel of the general revolutionary movement. There never was a specifically feminist movement in opposition to, and against the will of menfolk, as in the West. Russian women were far more energetic and dedicated to overall causes and ideologies than their Western sisters, quite prepared to fight for whatever they believed in, and not only with pen and ink, but also with fire and blood in an atmosphere of autocratic oppression. Maurice Hindus put it this way: I can think of no other movement in history where men and women lived on such terms of intimacy and camaraderie, of mutual respect and trust, and worked with such sublime selflessness for a common purpose. There were no discriminations or rivalries between the sexes. Under such circumstances, feminism in Russia never could assume the narrow form that it did in other lands, that is, a battle against the domination of men. Russia's Byzantine inheritance had something to do with this better understanding between the sexes, if only because of the extensive feminine component of Byzantine culture and the respect of Greek men for their women in Constantinople. Unfortunately, the feminine nature of Orthodox Christianity, with its one-sided emphasis on gorgeous paraphernalia, on glittering robes, icons, and jewelry, on all the ecclesiastical magic and mystery of Babylonian splendor, at the expense of moral sermonizing and inner spirituality, also doomed it as a bulwark and support for the Russian soul in times of great stress. The mere fact that Russian Orthodoxy dispensed with sermons and moral preaching symbolizes the fact that it had no ethical content. It had definite emotional appeal for women, but none for men. They were longing for a new ideological code of ethics, a new morality that would give meaning to their lives in place of the debased magico-mystical atmosphere of an ultra-conservative and petrified church that had no message whatsoever to impart, in fact, that never even sent missionaries to evangelize other people. In short, the Byzantine legacy that had done so much to elevate the Russian woman as an individual was also responsible for the lack of ethical framework that men absolutely require. A masculine reaction. A new Islam was in order, and it came with the 1917 October Revolution, along with a new Marxist-Leninist code of Spartan ethics in which the masculine element predominated absolutely. Although a Puritan in sexual matters, one who was actually shocked by the outspoken views of some of his female allies in politics on the matter of free love, more especially those of Inessa Armand and the beautiful Alexandra Kollontai, Lenin, at first lost no time in launching the legal emancipation of Russian women by striking down the major bulwark of civilized bourgeois life, the family, the one socio-biological entity that could stand as a protective shield between the individual and the all-destroying revolutionary state. He issued 2 decrees, in December 1917 and October 1918, establishing civil marriage as the only legally recognized form. An entry in the public marriage register was all that was needed, and making divorce a mere formality, obtainable immediately at the request of one of the partners, the famous postcard divorce. Children, however, were taken under the paternalistic wing of the state with no distinction made between legitimate and illegitimate. The law was no longer concerned with adultery. Starting in 1920, abortions were allowed without any restrictions whatsoever. Needless to say, males lost all their former prerogatives, and the legal emancipation of women was bolstered by their economic liberation when they were put to work outside the home. A few nurseries and daycare centers were established to assist them, along with extensive maternity leaves with full salary. The long-range goal was to emancipate the younger generation from parental influence and make it amenable to systematic Marxist-Leninist indoctrination. The Communist Party became the surrogate father of all children, and to the party were transferred all the patriarchal privileges hitherto belonging to the males. Parents of both sexes were stripped of all legal authority over their children, who were induced to show no respect for them. A young woman who went to school in Moscow testified, "In Moscow in 1921 there was a positive Soviet approach. I was 9, and we were left alone. We worked on the Dalton Plan. The teacher had no authority whatsoever. We were broken into units of 4 or 5 of our own choosing. The children in school had the feeling that they couldn't rely on their families. There was no such thing. The government encouraged it and said that it was the government who was supposed to take care of the children. We were completely liberated from our parents. We felt no responsibility to them." And as early as 1919, Soviet authorities decreed that the family has ceased to be a necessity both to its members and for the state. In those days, the sexual ethical radicalism of Alexandra Kollontai held full sway. Women had been nationalized, along with all the other means of production, although her numerous written works on the topic of free love repelled Lenin personally. His political designs compelled him to go along with the movement, insofar as it was the quickest and easiest way to destroy in depth the old society which he abhorred. It is worth recalling, incidentally, that Alexandra Kollontai was no proletarian, but the daughter of a czarist general, and came from a genuine bourgeois strata. No real proletarian woman could have thought in terms of sexual liberation along those lines. In a few short years, the great experiment began to fall apart. Men, stripped of their former paternal power and responsibilities, became neglectful toward their families and left the burden of the upbringing of the younger generation to the women, wives and mothers, usually assisted by the irreplaceable babushkas, older female relatives, who substituted for the planned but usual non-existent collective daycare centers. The collapse of family solidarity resulted in the mushrooming of juvenile delinquency on a staggering scale. And far from raising the status of women, the revolution proved to be utterly demoralizing. Rather than freeing women, it had freed men from sexual restraints and domestic responsibility, the two great gifts of stable marriage to women. The male revolutionary leaders had their pat justification. Lust is the collaborator of atheism. It will destroy social and bourgeois prejudices and regenerate feminine psychology. In fact, the new Soviet female was sexually oppressed as she had never been before. A perfect illustration of the revolutionary male attitude toward women is the official decree of the Soviet of Saratov, which stated, in February 1919, beginning with March 1, 1919, the right to possess women between the ages of 17 and 32 is abolished. The former owners of women retain the right to use them without awaiting their turn. By virtue of the present decree, no woman can any longer be considered as private property, and all women become the property of the nation. All women thus put at the disposition of the nation must, within 3 days after publication of the present decree, present themselves in person at the address indicated. Male citizens do not have the right to use women more often than prescribed. That is, 3 times a week and for 3 hours each time. Any man who wishes to make use of a nationalized woman must hold a certificate issued by the Administrative Council. If ever women have become purely sexual objects for men, it is in such revolutionary circumstances. In 1918, for example, the Soviet of Vladimir decreed that males could choose their conjugal partners, regardless of the latter's consent. Women became not only sexual objects but economic tools as well. The new Soviet woman was compelled to work 8 hours a day outside the home, in addition to bearing and raising children, cleaning house, cooking, washing, and searching for largely non-existent food and clothing. As recently as a half-century after the October Revolution, it is estimated that women in Moscow still spend 50% of their off-work time shopping, cooking, and washing laundry. Since party membership was overwhelmingly male, there was little or no sympathy wasted on the overburdened females, and male political careers in the Communist Party usually progressed on the wreckage of discarded wives and mistresses. In exchange for a few formal rights, Soviet women have been among the most exploited human groups in our century. A startling statistic given out in the Moscow Communist of November 1963 reveals that at the turn of the century, the average lifespan of a Russian woman was 2 years less than that of the average man, and that in the early 1960s, it was 8 years less. The author of the article places the responsibility for this relative reduction of Soviet women's life expectancy squarely on multiple abortions and the traumas of living conditions and working conditions. Meanwhile, with the consolidation of the revolution under Stalin, the collapse of the sexual revolution became institutionalized into a formal counter-revolution. The besprizerny, juvenile delinquents, the tragic result of the breakdown of family life, who roamed large areas of Russia in wolf-like packs and terrorized their elders, were hunted down and massacred without pity. The death sentence was applied to all delinquent children above the age of 12. Many voices were now fearlessly raised in favor of a re-establishment of strict laws to protect the family system. It became clear that the social chaos resulting from this catastrophic license would doom the 5-year plan on which Soviet Russia's hopes were based. Discipline was restored in the schools. The same witness quoted previously tells us that, around 1928, the teacher's authority became greater and greater. As time went on, my later experiences in school, the political situation changed, and it became something that was imposed on you. The democratic method, or choosing student representatives, was abolished. The representatives of the party were assigned to the school. Even the Soviet writers began a long campaign against free love, which can never be really free, and always ends in disappointment and harmful situations. The brutal contempt of Soviet men for their victimized female consorts was vividly portrayed in the novels of Nikitin, Gladkov, and Pilnyak, along with the hoary theme of the female seductress whose sexual wiles emasculate men and divert them from their productive tasks and ideals. The stage was set for a full-fledged restoration of the old family virtues, and even Lenin's well-known dislike for sexual promiscuity was invoked. Premarital chastity and conjugal fidelity were openly praised. Marriage breakers and promiscuous men were likely to be expelled from the party and find their careers ruined. Soviet writers began to shun descriptions of passionate love. Even the chastest kiss was hardly mentioned, and all new editions of the novels of the early phase of the revolution were carefully expurgated. The new Puritanism actually did as much to restore dignity to the Soviet woman as the total lack of sexual restraint in the early 1920s had done to degrade her. Formerly known as a bourgeois capitalistic slave invention, marriage was now officially extolled. The state cannot exist without the family. Marriage is a positive value for the socialist Soviet state only if the partners see in it a lifelong union. So-called free love is a bourgeois invention. Moreover, marriage receives its full value for the state only if there is progeny, and the consorts experience the highest happiness of parenthood. Chapter 3. The Communist Reality. Reverence for the elders was similarly enjoined. Young people should respect their elders, especially their parents. The respect and care of parents is an essential part of the Komsomol morale. All experiments with raising children in state institutions were declared failures, justifying the revival of the old-fashioned monogamic family. Under our present conditions, there is no doubt that the home offers a more stimulating environment for the development of the infant than the asylum. Not only have we decreased the death rate in this way, by placing the institutional children in private homes, but we have ensured normal development to a much larger proportion of babies, since in almost every case our asylum-trained babies were both mentally and physically backward. On June 27, 1936, new legislation was promulgated re-establishing the family officially as the nuclear basis of the state. Divorce became more difficult to obtain. Tax exemptions and various subsidies helped families with many children. The declining birth rate, in Great Russia especially, alarmed Soviet leaders, as it still does today. Abortion became again a criminal offense, except for strictly medical purposes. Oddly enough, this decision was put up for free discussion in plants, offices, and kolkhozes, and was vigorously criticized by the women. The law was promulgated nevertheless. Obviously, Stalin wished to strengthen the Soviet state, increasingly threatened by Germany's armed might, by encouraging women to breed more frequently. The terrible gap made in the population by the revolution, the civil war, and the political purges could be partly filled. In addition, the strengthening of marital and family ties made it possible to apply the principle of collective responsibility for the behavior of one of its members to the entire family, which became a virtual hostage of the state. On August 4, 1943, the Soviet authorities declared that coeducation on the elementary and secondary levels would be abolished, justifying this decision by the following comment: "A boy must be prepared for service in the Red Army while he is still at school. He receives special physical and purely military training for a stern soldier's life. What of the girl? She is essentially a mother. School must give the girl special knowledge of human anatomy, physiology, psychology, pedagogy, and hygiene." The realities of wartime circumstances made such a startling change in outlook inevitable. With it went an intensification of the affective bonds within the family, as enjoined in a textbook issued to teachers in the 1940s. The feeling of love for father and mother is the first noble feeling which arises naturally in a child, and which plays a central role in the life of every individual. Our children must appreciate how honorable is the title of mother in our land. Only in the Soviet Union has the state established the title of mother heroine, to those who have 10 children or more, and the bestowal of orders and medals on mothers of many children. In other words, Soviet women had reverted to the role of prize cow, and no professional achievement could bring her the honors that biological fertility brought in its train. From then on, laws were passed, altered, or repealed without taking too much into account the specific welfare of women. Only the welfare of the Soviet Union came into consideration. If the rulers in Moscow feel that the birth rate is too low, women are invited to breed more, and induced to do so by new financial advantages. After World War I, the authorities adopted for a while a more indifferent attitude in population matters. Abortion was allowed again in 1956. Although not encouraged, its legalization was designed to put an end to far more dangerous black market operations. In the early 1970s, however, there are signs that Soviet leaders are becoming alarmed at the rapidly declining birth rate of the ethnic Russians and other Slavs. Early in 1971, demographer Viktor Perivantsev quoted the following statistics in Literaturная Gazeta. In the decade of the 1960s, the Russian population had increased by 13%, while the Central Asian Muslims increased by 52%. He added that while only 8% of Belarusian women married as early as 18, 54% did so in Turkmenia. Conclusion: Russian women were invited to get to work producing more children by marrying earlier. Strongly encouraged to do so by the institution of the Order of Motherhood Glory and the granting of the Motherhood Medal. As in Sparta 2,500 years ago, bachelorhood is almost a crime in the contemporary Soviet. In Sparta, bachelors were excluded from the rolls of voting citizens and were compelled to remain nude in public, even in midwinter. Literaturная Gazeta virtually accused them of being traitors to Soviet society, selfish men who rob those who are married and support children, and, for a clincher, stated that they suffer from a special neurosis and a shorter lifespan, a medical fact confirmed in Western societies. Thus, in the Spartan model, women are made full use of to the point of being downright exploited. This, in spite of the fact that Marx had accused the bourgeois of looking upon his wife as nothing but an instrument of production, and had added, "He never dreams for a moment that our main purpose is to ensure that women shall no longer occupy the position of mere instruments of production." He should visit Soviet Russia today. Ironically, Soviet women almost appear to enjoy it. Busy night and day, dog-tired after a hard day's work, they are too exhausted even to think about their plight. Nor is it different in other Marxist lands. In Red Albania's textile factories, 90% of the labor force is female. Most of the field hands are also females. Meanwhile, according to a foreign observer, Tirana's cafes are crammed with men who can stretch a doll's cup of Turkish coffee throughout a whole steaming morning. They stand on their hundreds of street corners idly gossiping for hours on end, presumably waiting until their women get through doing the work. Whatever equality between the sexes is achieved in Marxist lands is due merely to the fact that their relatively inefficient regimes cannot afford the supreme capitalist luxury, a large idle female population, a wasteful policy made possible by far greater overall productivity in Western societies. The result is that woman power in Soviet Russia is a far more essential component of the national economy than it is in bourgeois countries. In fact, almost half the jobs are held by women. But what jobs? While it is true that some are engineers and technicians, the fact remains that women are mostly confined to low-paying manual work: street sweeping, bricklaying, garbage collecting, coal mining, and shiploading. They are steamfitters, riveters, and welders. In fact, the truth seems to be that labor is divided, by and large, along sexual lines. In many instances, women do the work and men oversee it. Labor laws discriminate in women's favor to the extent that they get daycare centers for their children and paid leave of absence for pregnancy. But they usually do the heavy work while male workers operate the machinery: forklifts, cranes, bulldozers, trucks, mechanical diggers. 80% of Soviet women are engaged in sheer physical labor, justified in the immediate post-war period, when manpower was scarce, but still true in the 1970s, when the same need no longer exists. Soviet women rarely reach positions of power and authority in their chosen field. In such positions as foreman or shop steward, men outnumber women 7-1. As one Western journalist put it, in practice, the Soviet woman is a drudge whose work has given her face the complexion and texture of tanned cowhide, and her fingers the look of raw carrots just pulled from the ground. As for political power, women can vote for the single candidate slates like the men. But of real power at the top, women's share of the Communist Party's Central Committee in the 1960s was merely 3%. One fact, evident in our Western societies, as it has been in all societies throughout history, seems just as true in Soviet Russia and other communist states. A sort of Gresham's law applies to the job market as it does to finances where bad money drives out good. Any profession in which women are numerous or in a majority is socially devalued and brings in lesser financial rewards. The Soviet statistics are eloquent. Out of approximately 600,000 medical practitioners, 75% are women, whereas in the United States, only 7% of the medical doctors are female. While the medical profession commands prestige and high remuneration in Western countries, it enjoys low status in the Soviet Union, where the starting salary of the average physician barely amounts to more than half that of a skilled worker. Male physicians are far from being considered the cream of Soviet manpower. This was why a man with a suspicious social background could get into medical school, although he couldn't get into an engineering school or scientific institute. The same applies, of course, to school teaching, in which women also outnumber men. A study of the situation reveals the following. The doctor is next to the lowest paid of professionals. Only school teachers are lower. The cream of Soviet manpower is encouraged to go into other work. And in recent years it has become something of a matter of apology for a male student to enter medical school, such an action being interpreted as an indication either that he had not the ability to become an engineer, or that he is politically unreliable. This is largely the explanation of the fact that since the revolution the proportion of women doctors has risen from 10% to over 75%. Wow! This is not all. Even within the medical corps, sexual discrimination is blatant. Perhaps fewer than 20% of doctors are members of the party. These party members are almost exclusively medical administrators. The administrators, in turn, are also predominantly male. The pattern which is evolving is that of a medical profession which is composed of non-party, female, practicing physicians, and party, male, medical administrators. Still, medicine is about the highest the average woman can reach. The majority are field hands on the collective farms, the most poorly rewarded and most exploited of any except the residents of forced labor camps. The woman collective farmer has the least attractive life of any of the rank-and-file Soviet citizens. The Soviet Russian male is firmly in the saddle, in full control of the party apparatus and the Soviet social structure. Soviet women have become again, willy-nilly, what they have always been, beasts of burden. But we must introduce an important caveat. It would be a mistake to overlook what some shrewd foreign observers of Soviet Russia have pointed out: the remarkable resemblance between modern Soviet women and the picture drawn by Tolstoy in the Cossacks. The Cossack looks on woman as an instrument of his well-being. He permits young girls to gad about, but he compels his peasant woman to work for him from youth, even to advanced old age, and he regards a woman with an Eastern demand to submission and labor. As the result of such a view, the woman who develops intensively both physically and morally, even though she is externally submissive, obtains, as generally in the East, an influence and weight in domestic life that is beyond comparison greater than in the West. The man feels confusedly that everything he uses and calls his own is the product of this woman's work, and that it is in the power of the woman, mother or wife, whom he counts his serf, to deprive him of everything that is of any use to him. Moreover, the continual masculine, heavy work, and the worries that are entrusted to her hands have given a particularly independent, masculine character to the woman, and to a surprising degree have developed in her physical strength, decisiveness, and firmness of character. This appears to be the case with most Soviet women today. Revolution struck China in a different context. Unlike half-westernized and Christian Russia, China had an immensely old civilization whose disintegration early in the century was a far more traumatic event than even Russia's social revolution. It was the collapse of a completely autonomous, self-contained civilization, stretching all the way back to the dawn of the Iron Age. It was a long drawn-out process that started with the overthrow of the Manchu dynasty in 1911 and is still going on in the 1970s. More than 2 decades after the communists seized power, Chinese civilization and its essentially Confucian core began to fall apart early in the century under the impact of Western civilization. Long before Marxism made its influence felt, this disintegration struck the cities rather than the immense countryside where the rural populations went on living as before, faithful to the old traditions to the extent permitted by the appalling anarchy and warlordism that had settled on the land. The basic innovation of Mao Zedong's Red regime was to provoke in the countryside the same socio-political upheaval that the impact of the West had spontaneously provoked in the urban centers. An immense tidal wave that engulfed the hundreds of millions of Chinese peasants for whom the disappearance of the Son of Heaven from Peking's Forbidden City had been, until then, a remote and nebulous event. The fundamental self-appointed task confronting the new rulers in the early 1950s was the metamorphosis of a thoroughly decentralized people, enjoying self-rule to the utmost thanks to the autonomy of its clans, into a unified nation, forcibly propelled into a new form of civilization by an all-powerful centralized state. This task could only be fulfilled by the complete destruction of the traditional kinship system and the ideology that upheld it. In short, the Chinese Reds were faced with the same problem that confronted the Russian Bolsheviks when they came to power. In order to sweep away the old order, they had to pulverize the traditional family structure by freeing women from their traditional obligations as wives and privileges as mothers and mothers-in-law, and by setting the younger generations against the old and the great. Cultural Revolution of the late 1960s. Here again. The liberation of woman was designed to destroy the old fabric and emancipate youth from its traditional reverence for oldsters, without really giving woman greater scope for her talents in the new structure to come. Traditional Chinese society had been completely centered around its kinship system of clannish relations, and therefore divided into innumerable autonomous and mutually exclusive kinship cells, the opposite of the mass society that prevails increasingly in the West, and that Marxism attempts to bring about forcibly whenever it comes to power. The Chinese kinship system was based on its peculiar matrimonial concepts. Marriage implied basically that the husband's family acquired a daughter-in-law, Chu Hashi Fu, against payment to her family of a body price, whose control over her, and therefore protection, then lapsed forever. In Hubei province, a common saying had it that, in a betrothal, when a daughter goes out, an ox comes in. There could be no divorce, and all the bride could look forward to was motherhood, as many sons as possible, and eventually, the satisfaction of becoming a mother-in-law in her turn. In this patriarchal context, tension was in fact rather between mother and daughter-in-law than between husband and wife. The gradual introduction of divorce in the cities after the overthrow of the Manchus, and its swift implementation throughout the countryside after the Reds took over in 1949, implied the potential liberation of woman, not so much from the male tyranny of her husband, as liberation from the future half of her own self as potential mother-in-law. But this was consonant with the complete destruction of the traditional kinship system with its clan and extended family. The process of erosion of the traditional structure was already underway in the 1920s, when Mao Zedong started his political career in the Chinese countryside. Considerably shaken by the anti-Confucian revolution triggered by the non-communist intellectuals in Peking and the hysterical destruction of the old culture's values and landmarks, women began to feel uncertain. The great impoverishment of millions of rural homes caused by the swiftly spreading anarchy and endless civil wars further undermined the venerable traditions. In March 1927, Mao was moved to comment, "As to the authority of the husband, it has always been comparatively weak among the poor peasants, because the poor peasant women, compelled for financial reasons to take more part in manual work than women of the wealthier classes, have obtained more right to speak and more power to make decisions in family affairs. In recent years, rural economy has become even more bankrupt, and the basic condition for men's domination over women has already been undermined. And now, with the rise of the peasant movement, women in many places have set out immediately to organize the Rural Women's Association. The opportunity has come for them to lift up their heads, and the authority of the husband is tottering more and more every day. In a word, all the feudal and patriarchal ideologies and institutions are tottering. The abolition of the clan system, of superstitions and of inequality between men and women, will follow as a natural consequence of victory in political and economic struggles. The innate conservatism of women, however, had to be overcome and their traditional beliefs and loyalties destroyed. More than once, Mao remarked that, in places where the power of the peasants is predominant, only the older peasants and the women still believe in gods. But wherever the action of his rural Soviets was successful, women rebelled against time-hallowed traditions. The old rule that forbids women and poor people to attend banquets in the ancestral temple has also been broken. On one occasion, the women of Peikuo, Hengshan, marched into their ancestral temple, sat down on the seats and ate and drank, while the grand patriarchs could only look on. Wherever they were, the communists worked hard at undermining the traditional kinship system. But, again, a great deal of destruction had already been accomplished by their rivals before they came to power. The first and second drafts of the new marriage laws, in 1911 and 1915, provided that only the consent of the parents was required. In 1916, the consent of the marital partners was tacked on. And finally, in 1931, the Kuomintang decided to do away with parental consent altogether, leaving only the consent of the partners, and legalizing divorce. In effect, the urbanized and partly westernized Chinese had already begun the work of destruction of the patriarchal clan. The communists had their work started for them. All they had to do was extend it throughout the countryside. But it was only when they actually came to power all over China in 1949 that they struck hard, and immediately, at what was left of the old social structure. On May 1, 1950, the Chinese Communists promulgated the new marriage law, Dado. While it provided for greater equality between husband and wife, it also contained a retroactive clause. The Government Administrative Council issued a directive which specified that large-scale complaint meetings must be held to expose those marriages which do not comply with the provisions of this new marriage law. As Professor Chao Ching-wei, a former high-ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party who took part in the drafting of the law, says, "I found out too late that the motives of the CC for doing anything are seldom what they seem, and the passing of the marriage law was no exception." Soon enough, communist cadres persuaded millions of naive housewives to complain against husbands and in-laws at widely publicized public meetings. Professor Chao states, "The result was that marriages which had been arranged by heads of families or in which cash payments were involved were annulled, and millions of families were broken up." In doing this, the CC also incidentally gathered detailed information about every household, which they used to carry through the land reform movement. This is what they were really aiming at. With the destruction of the traditional family system, nothing more stood between the isolated individual, male or female, and the all-powerful monolithic state and party. Chao Ching-wei, a participant and eyewitness, adds, "During this period, in almost every village in the country, there was tumult in every household. The trials and tribulations of the struggle meetings were responsible for many a suicide and even murder. Wives who were forced to complain against their husbands came back from struggle meetings and hanged themselves. Others, who went to cadres to seek help for divorce, came back and were killed by their husbands. I remember from the reports received at the Committee on Political and Legal Affairs, in Jiangsu province alone, 15,000 people died because of the marriage reform in the month of August in 1952. The total number of deaths all over the country for which the marriage reform was responsible must have amounted to hundreds of thousands." No. This nuclear social explosion was by no means designed to free the Chinese woman, but to enslave her to the state, and individually often enough to the more important male party members. During this time, cadres took advantage of the new provisions which allowed a person to love anyone of his choice, to chase girls, especially those from landlords' families, and make these victims sleep with them. Another analyst reported, "What these little despots in the villages did with the women was so low and contemptible that it shocked the not oversensitive leaders in Peking. Party members ordered husbands and wives to separate, and if any resisted, they were sent to jail as counter-revolutionists, or were handed over to the village militia, which soon became notorious for its licentious behavior. Those not themselves philanderers indulged in the nationwide sport of fornicator catching, confessions being extracted from women by physical torture. No wonder suicides and violent deaths amongst women showed a rapid increase." Meanwhile, in 1952, the 3 anti and 5 anti movements began to sweep the urban areas. Wives were mobilized to persuade their husbands to confess to various assorted crimes. Too talkative for their own good, wives often unwittingly betrayed their family secrets to the authorities. Former kinship loyalties were forcibly shifted to the red state. Now it was wife against husband, sister against brother, son against mother, and all the while a long drawn-out explosion was tearing apart the kinship fabric of Chinese society. This could not go on forever, and eventually Peng Chen informed the Committee on Political and Legal Affairs that the situation in rural areas has become chaotic. Too many people have died because of the marriage reform. We must try to stop it. Chao Ching-wei adds, but by that time, the Communist Party had achieved their purpose, which was to break up millions of homes and isolate individuals to make them turn to the Communist Party for help. This helped them to push through the land reform and other movements. Nothing could stop the party juggernaut. The authorities organized the All China Democratic Women's Federation, and in April 1953, its second National Congress convened. Not so much in order to air Chinese women's long-standing grievances as to convince them, consciousness-raising, that these grievances were real and should be put at the service of the party. Yet, the People's Daily had to admit in 1954 that the women in the countryside have been in the forefront in resisting socialization. Conditions had finally become so dismal that the Department of Justice of the Northeast Regional Government had to point out that the People's Government is not promoting divorce, and the marriage law is not a divorce law. Those who take freedom of divorce for divorce at will are committing a grave error. Worse still, this chaos gravely affected production and even party discipline, to the point where divorce became almost unobtainable whenever it threatened economic productivity or the morale of the members of the armed forces. After 1953, worldwide, there was a partial return to the old values, even on the part of party members, and more than once the situation was such that, rather than the husband's or the mother-in-law's opposition, it was the obstacle of the cadres that was the hardest to overcome. They had come back full circle to the view that good women hanged themselves, a result of family discord. Only bad women seek divorce. In 1955, they were advised to recognize the social value of being a family woman. If women who stay at home can encourage their husbands and children to take part in socialist reconstruction, and educate their children to become members of the next shift in the work of socialist reconstruction, then their domestic service already contains revolutionary and social value, and the salaries and income of their husbands and other family members already contain their own labor. It would have been too much to expect that men, whether revolutionary or reactionary, would agree to grant full equality to women. Further, by raising women's expectations beyond any possibility of fulfillment, the new laws had greatly increased the social chaos generated by the breakdown of the traditional clans. This was grave, since the main purpose of the liberation of Chinese women was to put them to much harder work than they had been accustomed to in the bad old days. Woman power was put to full use in the wheat, rice, and cotton fields, as well as in the small commune industries. Most of the time, farm hands were paid with work points, a system which invariably favors men who, being physically stronger, accumulate more points. Chinese women apparently were not as strong as Russian women, and their health began to deteriorate sufficiently to alarm the authorities. Early in 1971, an article in the People's Daily quoted a survey taken in a random county in Jiangsu province, to the effect that 20% of the women could not assume a normal share of the collective work, and that half of all women had some kind of ailment. Such loss of labor power could not be tolerated, and medical treatment was started on a massive scale. Working women are precious chattel in Red China. Inevitably, there was a steady retreat from the earlier revolutionary pro-feminist stance. The rebellion of women, such as it was, had fulfilled its main task, to destroy the traditional clan system and family solidarity, which stood as the main obstacle on the road to socialization and the supremacy of the state. Now, the time had come for the reconstruction of the new society. In the last part of 1955, a communist directive began to stress that the building of a democratic and harmonious new family, united for production, and devoted to the cause of socialist reconstruction, was woman's main responsibility. Household work was increasingly socialized with the creation of millions of nurseries and kindergartens, public mess halls and dormitories, presumably freeing women from childcare, cooking, and other household chores so as to enable them to contribute to the collective work, although the marriage law did not stipulate it. Young Chinese were discouraged from marrying early because of its disturbing effect on study, work, and even health. The puritanical authorities frowned on excessive sexual activity, having fulfilled their purpose as male-directed revolutionary instruments. Chinese women were firmly enjoined to give up any kind of militant struggle for the exclusive betterment of their sex social position. But at no time have the communist authorities indicated that they wanted to do away with the family altogether. Far from it. Even if they had wanted this, the staggering cost, in terms of economic disruption, and the unending conflicts this would entail, would have prevented them from attempting it. The main objective, all along, was the destruction of the socio-economic power of the clan and the kinship loyalty which stood as a powerful screen between the state and the individual. Having reached this goal with remarkable dispatch, the 2 or even 3 generation family could be left in peace. But even where the extended family structure remained intact, and where the conjugal couple remained with parents or in-laws, the latter had lost all power of coercion. The constant exaltation of youth and ruthless contempt for impotent old age had done away with the old gerontocratic supremacy. Now that economic self-interest in the clan cooperative community had disappeared, only ties based on mutual affection could keep a Chinese extended family together. In terms of social, economic, and political power, the old kinship system and structure based on a hierarchy of generational levels has ceased to exist in Red China. As in Russia, sexual segregation at work is striking. The raising of children in nurseries and kindergarten is exclusively done by women. Jobs that have not been mechanized are allotted to women. But most of the highest paid jobs, or those that are the most prized in the educational system, are given to men. In the summer of 1971, a group of American scholars, fresh out of the Western atmosphere pervaded by women's liberation arguments, were quite surprised that, when we asked why these differences between male and female employment continue, we were usually told that women are by nature better suited to some tasks, such as gentle care of the sick patient, rearing of children, and meticulous sewing, or inspection tasks where perfection is required. Neither the men nor the women seem to question the assumption that there are these sorts of inherent differences between men and women. What struck them most is not only the fact that higher education is largely a male prerogative, but that all leadership jobs are disproportionately male, with one or two exceptions. This means that every commune, every school, every factory, every hospital, every local government branch which we visited had many more men than women in its revolutionary committee. We found that even in factories where the workers are mostly female, the leadership is heavily male. At the top, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party has only 15 women out of 170 members, just about the same ratio as in most other communist parties, in or out of power. A significant incident illustrates the fact that, deep down, the Red Chinese find this overwhelmingly male leadership normal. Having put the question, how many men are on your revolutionary committee and party committee, and how many women, at Peking University, the people speaking to us, many of them members of these leadership committees, looked at us blankly and said that they had never noticed. Since women and men are completely equal in China now, who would think to ask that question, they said. We persisted, so somebody went off to look it up, and came back a little sheepishly with the information that the Revolutionary Committee has 5 women and 34 men, and the Party Committee has 5 women and 42 men. 3 of the 5 women on each committee are the same. So really only 7 women in all get to participate in top leadership at Peking University. When it came to investigating the problem of household chores, it was more of the same. The old patriarchal division of labor, which relegated all the household tasks to women, has not been very much modified in the People's Republic of China. Almost everywhere, when we asked who washes the clothes by hand, who takes care of the children after they come home from school, who buys the food, who cooks the meals, who cleans the house, who does the sewing, the answer was, the wife, of course. But the visiting scholars were also witness to the strong family feelings that still persist, regardless of the disintegration of the traditional clans. 3, and sometimes 4 generations live together or as close together as they can. And they were struck by another fact. It was obvious wherever we went in China that parents, grandparents and children have close relationships and enjoy doing things and going places together. Far from weakening the family, the employment of women and the child care facilities that permit this have really strengthened it. Put in succinct terms, the Red Chinese woman has been emancipated from the tutelage of the traditional clan, only to fall under that of the party and state, both of which are almost entirely male-controlled. As in Russia, some women hold minor positions of leadership in the apparatus, partly as window dressing, but the higher echelons are invariably in men's hands. Those few women who do play a role are usually related to high office-holding males who enjoy direct power, and their influence is merely derivative. For instance, Tsai Chang, who was for years the highest-ranking woman as a member of the Central Committee and chairman of the Women's Federation, also happened to be the wife of Deputy Premier Li Fuchun, Mao Zedong's 4th wife. The notorious Qiang Qing cannot be omitted, if only because of the part she played in the Cultural Revolution. But another aspect of her influence must be noted: her rivalry with, and hatred for, China's former chief of state Liu Shaoqi's wife, which became legendary. Beautiful and brilliant Wang Guangmei, for long read China's first lady, waged a relentless war against Chiang Qing, and a great deal of the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution can be laid at the doorsteps of these two ruthless ladies, both worthy successors of that paragon of female ruthlessness, the Dowager Empress Chsi. All in all, except for some wives of powerful men, few women play any important part in Red China. Only a small fraction of the leadership, at any level, is female, and the closer one gets to the hard core of power, the less direct influence women possess. Females occupy the lower rungs of the revolutionary ladder. What is traditionally known as big menism prevails in Red China, as it does in Soviet Russia, and there are no real signs that it is waning. Woman power was successfully used as a battering ram against the old Confucian fortress. Now that the fortress has collapsed, it is used as productive economic power. As for the rest of it, regardless of pious wishes and forecasts, the socialist liberation of Red Chinese womanhood, one can only quote a familiar Chinese expression, a light breeze that leaves no traces at all. In an article published in the early 1970s, Simone de Beauvoir, no mean feminist of extreme left political persuasion, wrote that socialism has brought no benefits, or practically none, to women. She's quite correct. The Marxist revolutions of the 20th century, in adopting the Spartan model, have cunningly made full use of woman power, in both a destructive and then constructive sense, but without giving woman per se any greater share of ultimate power or responsibility. Freed from subservience to patriarchal families, they have collectively fallen under the domination of their successors, male-ruled totalitarian societies organized on a pharaonic scale, usually puritanical in sexual matters once their power is secure. Marxist regimes have, to a marked degree, enhanced the dignity of womanhood, as had the early Christians in the dissolving Roman Empire. But dignity can be granted at the expense of power or influence. By its very nature, revolution is masculine in spirit, in a direct line of descent from all the monotheistic creeds in which historical development progresses, not smoothly along evolutionary lines, but in spasmodic fashion by way of sudden restructuring of the entire social and political order. The Marxist creed, in particular, endowed, as Bertrand Russell expressed it, with a cosmic optimism which only theism could justify, is essentially a prophetic faith which subordinates the means to a more or less mythical end, allowing the simultaneous coexistence of a good conscience and evil instincts. Chief among those means is the full use of woman power in a subordinate way, in marked contrast with Western societies in which so much of the enormous middle-class component is wasted away, without even the consoling illusion of working toward that elusive millennium. In between the West and the Marxist worlds lies the rest, the far-flung third world strung around the globe's tropical and equatorial belts, made up of widely disparate elements. We can start with the Arab countries, where left-wing socialist revolution often, if not usually, signifies a return to pure, puritanical, and anti-feminist traditions. Modern Islam has had, to a modest extent, its feminists and advocates of woman's emancipation. The Egyptian Qasim Amin, whose emancipation of woman stirred middle-class Arab women, and another popular Egyptian Muslim, who advocated liberating and putting to social and economic use what he chose to call the Arab world's unused lung. Unused lung. But, by and large, Muslim women remain more or less where they have always been, in the virtual seclusion of the kitchen and the nursery. They are likely to remain there for the foreseeable future, especially in the more revolutionary Arab states such as Algeria and Libya, where a return to a puritanical but traditional Islamic past works to women's ultimate disadvantage. In contrast, India, still faithful to its traditional civilization, socially conservative to a large extent, grants far more prestige and influence to its women than Red China, for instance. It is in its inherent social conservatism and its persisting endogamic caste system that Indian womanhood finds the true source of its enduring influence. In all other lands, Asian, African, or Latin American, where military dictatorship has become the almost normal form of government, except in Argentina, the all-male military establishments effectively block any access women might have to positions of power and influence. Out of the socialist trend that became immensely strong at the turn of the century in Eastern Europe's Jewish communities, emerged what is perhaps the most creative social experiment of the century: the Israeli kibbutz, group in Hebrew. A utopia come true. In Martin Buber's words, the only experiment which did not fail. To go from the gigantic pharaonic empires such as Soviet Russia and Red China to minute social organisms consisting of a few hundred people is like going from macrocosm to microcosm, basically. However, the difference is that the macrocosm is based on enormous concentrations of power in few hands, and therefore on coercion for the rest, whereas the microcosm has done away with all forms of concentration of power and domination of one human being over another. It is unique in its amalgam of collectivism and complete freedom, and this without in any way falling into anarchism, quite the contrary. Over 60 years have now gone by since the first collective settlement was established in Degania, then part of the Ottoman Empire, by East European settlers escaping from the shtetl, ghetto, way of life and its typical Jewish patriarchalism. An outcrop of the socialist ideology that swept through Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. And of the opening of Yiddish culture to Western influence, this peculiar brand of Zionism embodied to the full the age-old characteristic of the Hebrew Jewish spirit, that of the irresistible will produced by the messianic drive. It is largely the predominance of this will that explains why the kibbutz way of life is the only experiment that did not fail. Unlike all the other communal utopias tried and given up by weaker-willed Europeans and Americans. From the start, the feminist component loomed large in the formulation of the kibbutz ideology, the revolt against the tight-knit, money-conscious patriarchal family of the ghetto. According to this ideology, there was to be no real family in the kibbutz, and the sexes were to be completely equal in every respect. One should emphasize again that feminism as such can arise only in societies that are aggressively masculine, such as the Jewish one. The early ideology of the movement laid great stress, however, on the biological tragedy of woman, and, in one pamphlet, mention was made of the fact that the only obstacle in the way of achieving true equality of the sexes was the unfortunate physical differences between men and women. In any patriarchal society, the feminist rebellion takes place wholly unconsciously within a masculine framework, since it understands no other, and always lays stress on the greater value of man's work. Hence, in the early kibbutzim, women were to work alongside the men and share equally in their labors. Pursuits considered typically feminine, such as household work, services, and rearing children, were immediately socialized. All kibbutzniks eat together in a communal dining hall, and children are entrusted to professional guardians, the metapalets, who raise them in separate children's houses. Thus, according to the theory, female kibbutzniks would be free to devote themselves to productive, i.e. masculine, work on a par with the men. Some 6 decades have gone by since this ideology was first materialized in concrete collectives. Second and third generations have appeared. And that the movement is still very much alive is proved by new collective settlements springing up all over Israel, many of them started by recruits from the youth movement. But the movement is alive only because it faced realities, foremost among them the enduring difference between the sexes. Pragmatic, ever adapting to new circumstances without being fettered by dogmatism, the kibbutz movement is about the only organic social entity that actually lives its dream freely, and from which valuable lessons and conclusions can unquestionably be drawn. The first noteworthy conclusion that can be made is that the present-day kibbutz reality is very far from the vision beheld. In terms of sexual equality by the early Zionists in Eastern Europe, after a short period of hesitation and free love in the early settlements, the family structure was promptly re-established and the marital bonds strengthened. Today, 60 years later, both are stronger than ever. Their own Center for Social Research on the Kibbutz in Jvat Haviva states it this way: today, the family fulfills an important role in the social structure of the kibbutz. The family has no economic role, and no role in consumption. It has only a partial role in the process of socialization and education, but it fulfills important functions in the social and emotional integration of the kibbutz, and especially is a link between generations. Our contention is that the kibbutz is changing from a society in which the family did not receive full legitimation as the basic social unit, to a society placing more and more stress on the family group. even in the left wing, Marxist-oriented group of the kibbutz Artsy, it is claimed that experience has strengthened the conviction that the parents are the most important factor in the education and healthy development of their children. Collective education does not question the unique emotional tie between parent and child, so that the problem has not been how to weaken them, but on the contrary, how to make them into a more stable and permanent source of security, and how to integrate them into education for communal life. The rate of divorce is very low in the collectives, far lower than in society at large. It should also be emphasized that in sexual matters, kibbutzniks display a very strong puritanical streak. In fact, there is absolutely no contradiction between the strengthening of the family bond and the other two great loyalties that stamp the kibbutz way of life: the strong emotional attachment of the individual members to the peer group with which they were brought up, and the equally strong sentimental link with the entire kibbutz, which represents home to most of the younger members of the second and third generations. What the kibbutz really represents in historical terms is a way of overcoming the deficiencies of the modern nuclear family's selfish isolation, loneliness and brittleness, and of reintegrating it in a much larger, if artificial, extended family. That a healthy collective is indeed a vast family is quite obvious to any outsider who spends any length of time in one of them. All the adults behave toward all the children of the kibbutz like so many affectionate uncles and aunts, grandfathers and grandmothers, with the typical warmth of members of a tribal group, similar in some ways to the Andaman Islanders, whose married couples often exchange their children. In effect, the Andaman child acquires several sets of parents who all share the responsibility, love, and affection that the natural parents are expected to devote to them. In fact, there is some evidence that the entire kibbutz movement may represent a retribalization with a new set of unformulated rules of endogamy. Kibbutz youngsters often prefer to marry other kibbutzniks, and exogamy, they rarely marry within their own kibbutz. This also explains in part why there are almost no Oriental Jews in the kibbutzim. They still live in their own extended families. Meantime, what has happened to the woman's role in kibbutz life? The first striking thing about it is that the daughters of the pioneering first generation of feminists are no longer feminists per se. They show no particular preference for typically masculine work. Quite the contrary. What was bound to happen happened. Sex-typed roles, in terms of work and social activity, slowly re-established themselves. As one authority pointed out, kibbutzim are finding that the goal of freeing women from household tasks is becoming increasingly unworkable. As the community grows older, a tremendous pressure develops to put more people to work in childcare, to improve the dining room service, to provide more clothing. The women, therefore, are pulled out one by one, often against their will, from whatever else they are doing, and placed in the services. The fiction of equality is still maintained to an extent. Such subtle euphemisms as the distinction between mechanical equality and qualitative equality are often used when work is distributed along gender lines. But it may well be that the accepted orientation today is that there are basic differences between the sexes in abilities, characteristics, aspirations, and social roles, so that each should have its own particular and separate sphere of activity. In practice, it is usually found that inequality does in fact arise as a result of this differentiation. There was, at the start, an implicit contradiction between the movement's overall aspirations and the harsh reality of an ascetic way of life. In the early stages, preference was inevitably given to productivity at the expense of the services in which women were later asked to serve, thereby increasing sexual differentiation and some feeling of deprivation among the women. Yet, as recent investigations have shown, this particular character of the feeling of deprivation in the spheres of work and social activity also explains the fact that we found only very few expressions of competition and rivalry between the sexes. To the extent that complaints against men or against the institutions exist, these do not usually refer to deprivation but rather to the lack of sufficient encouragement. In sum, the old dream of the pioneering feminists has vanished, in spite of all the masculine goodwill that it incorporated, and sexual work roles have been re-established, de facto. It is striking that the older the kibbutz, the less egalitarian the socio-sexual structure, the younger ones still attempt to keep the egalitarian dream alive. the egalitarian attitude will be most strongly entrenched in the younger kibbutzim. At least in the veteran settlements, in the mid-position will be held in the intermediate type of kibbutz, since the processes of differentiation in the older kibbutzim will be accepted as natural by the second generation. Women of this generation will be the least egalitarian. The trend towards strengthening family bonds, at the insistence of the women themselves, is so strong that some of the younger kibbutzim are now allowing mothers to raise their children at home, and no longer in special children's houses under the guardianship of the metaplets. It seems that the experience has come full circle and returned to its point of departure by re-establishing the strong family structure of the typical Jewish family, but without sacrificing the great advantage of integrating it in the artificial, non-biological extended family which the kibbutz lifestyle offers. All the statistical evidence garnered by sociological students of the movement indicates that the interest and aspirations of the women, according to the respondents, concentrate on the family in the wider sense of the word. This sphere is not mentioned at all for men, whose alleged spheres of interest are wider and more variegated. Wow. By and large, male kibbutzniks are more satisfied with their work than the women, for whose sake the services have considerably improved, and many unprofitable or non-profit-making types of work, poultry farms, orchards, etc., have been maintained in the hope that these undertakings will keep them happy within the kibbutzim. Thus it is that the boldest and most creative social experiment of the century teaches us that there is no social organization that can guarantee more than a qualitative equality between the sexes, and that pair bonding, marriage, and the family are, in the long run, indestructible in a healthy society. Chapter 3. Cultural Revolution in the West. Shifting from the communist reality to the West is like moving from the consequence to the cause, from the twisted duplicate to the original. Marxism, as a historical phenomenon, is a militant doctrine based on rigid organization, blind discipline, hierarchy, and efficiency applied to the tactical conquest of power and the strategic use of that power. Its revolutionary aspect is a means to an end, the elimination of Western power and influence throughout the non-Western world, a counter-imperialism to answer Western imperialism. In fact, the West is where the true revolution is taking place because it is there that the trouble started in the first place, in the only cultural organism that was, and still is, evolving freely rather than compulsively. The rest of the world has been essentially reacting to the Western impact in one guise or another, and has originated nothing really new in the process. For example, feminist problems in the non-Western world, to the extent that there are any problems, aside from the utilization of womanhood as a revolutionary tool, are merely projections of Western influence, not original problems. The Israeli kibbutzim are essentially a Western experiment carried out in the Middle East. Only in the West is there constant innovation and, therefore, constant revolution. In depth. What is the nature of this cultural revolution? When Nietzsche, with prophetic prescience, proclaimed the death of God, he was really proclaiming the death of man. Man was the mere raw material out of which Superman can eventually make himself. If, as acknowledged by contemporary radical theologians, man killed God, the Nietzschean vision is correct. Man killed God by an act of man's free will, and man must now assume personal responsibility for his own finiteness. Nietzsche's implication is that the death of God implies the death of the murdered, and of the murderer himself, the end of man and the beginning of a new cycle of eternal recurrence. When contemporary radical theologians assert that the death of God is a historical event that has happened in our lifetime, that we should not shrink from facing the fact, what they are really saying is that the traditional Western relationship between man and God has broken down. The religiously oriented man no longer feels the Almighty's presence and can no longer communicate with Him. The Almighty no longer exists for us, but this is merely another way of saying that man no longer exists. Basically, these theologians take their cue from Nietzsche, who 2,000 years after the ancient Greeks had located and identified the tomb of the dead Zeus exclaimed, "What are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and monuments of God?" The process of theological disintegration is easy to follow. Starting from Karl Barth's absolute separation between the divine and the secular, the death of God school dismissed the former, separating Christianity from religion and focusing exclusively on Jesus Christ, the man. Paul Tillich contributed the rejection of theism and Bultmann, the rejection of mythology. Theology was thus reduced to Christ, the historical figure, and to man's self-understanding, a topic that might as well have been left to professional psychologists. In other words, with the death of God, true theology simply evaporated. Advanced Muslim thinking does the same thing, dismisses Allah and focuses on the historical reality of Muhammad and the moral teaching of the Quran. Even Israeli Marxists, atheists to the core, enjoin their youngsters to study the Old Testament thoroughly as a prime historical document propounding basic ethical values. In other words, far from focusing on what unites all religions and all human beings, that is, on the fundamental identity of God, Allah, Yahweh, contemporary theologians and religious leaders focus on the specific and divisive historical roots of their respective creeds. This is the tail end of an evolution that began with the collapse of the medieval outlook. By stripping the Godhead of feminine attributes, the Christian Reformation unwittingly altered completely the meaning of creation, which could no longer be conceived out of nothing. If the Godhead is not bisexual, that is, beyond sexual opposition, matter has to be credited with some kind of pre-existence, and endowed with the powers of maternity, hence the natural and easy transition from Judaic Protestant theism to Marxist materialism. We are today in the throes of a fundamental negation. And because of this we have lost all creative contact with the holy and sacred, the dark night of the Western soul. Some seek refuge in Gnosticism with its rejection of the world and the profane. Others embrace the contemporary profanity and the dialectical hope that, by doing so, they will ultimately retrieve its very opposite, the holy and sacred. Their general attitude can be summed up this way: our waiting for God. Our godlessness is partly a search for a language and a style by which we might be enabled to stand before Him once again, delighting in His presence. In the time of waiting we have a place to be. It is not before an altar. It is in the world, in the city, with both the needy neighbor and the enemy. The destruction of the mythological outlook prompts many to seek a non-religious theology, if there can be such a thing, and a non-religious interpretation of the Gospels. But the destruction of the mythological outlook really implies the cutting off of all deliberate contact between man's conscious thinking and his symbol-making unconscious. This is what Bultmann does when he claims that only two types of thinking are permissible: scientific and existentialist, because they operate on two different and unconnected planes. Along with the reinterpretation of mythical thinking in existential terms, again, an exacerbation of the masculine divisive principle. But the human mind is as steeped in unconscious symbolism and mythology as an iceberg is 9/10 submerged in water. From deep in the unconscious it draws its imaginative nourishment, without which it is mentally sick. Symbol-making is man's most profound and necessary mental activity. An exaggerated striving after objectification must destroy symbolism because symbols are subjective. But, as a product of the collective unconscious, they are also intersubjective, and just as psychologically real as any object found in nature outside human consciousness. To demythologize, as the Greeks eventually did, is to deny this intersubjective reality and suffer the psychological consequences, the death of artistic and cultural creativity, the disruption of the connection between conscious and unconscious, and disharmony in the relations between the sexes. Unless this link is re-established, contemporary man's and woman's self-identification will disintegrate. Some indications that this is happening are already at hand. In Beyond Freedom and Dignity. B.F. Skinner makes it quite plain that in the world outlook of the behaviorist school, man no longer exists as an autonomous, free-willing entity. If he thinks he does, this is only an illusion. Nothing specifically human remains in the Skinnerian world, but bundles of environmental influences, with no man to control or experience them. To man qua man we readily say, good riddance. In an earlier work, Science and Human Behavior, Skinner firmly rejected the existence of such things as mind and ideas, and added that they had been invented for the sole purpose of providing spurious explanations. And he added, since mental or psychic events are asserted to lack the dimensions of physical science, we have an additional reason for rejecting them. This is the logical outcome of the process of objectification that started with the classical Greeks and ends in the utter destruction of the knowing and feeling subject. This nightmarish behavioral utopia is based on the arbitrary assumption that man is merely the focus of environmental forces, nothing more. There is no mental being, no autonomous personality, no free will, ego, character, mind, or soul. Behavioral technology, based on the notion that behavior is determined from without and not from within, will alter the environment rather than the human being, who will change as his environment changes. Pushing scientific materialism to its absurd, yet logical consequences, Skinner faithfully represents one important intellectual trend of our times and gives striking expression to the fundamental psychological trend of the contemporary West. The gradual disappearance of man as he had been thought of for some 2 centuries, through the dislocation of his twin being as knowing subject, now eliminated, and object of knowledge. This disappearance of man would eventually entail the simultaneous disappearance of woman and of the present tension between the sexes. This in no way implies that Skinner's rat-like perspective of human destiny will survive. Far from it. It is only one episode in a process of intellectual breakdown. But Skinner's destructive vision corresponds to the increasing profanity of the age, a succinct and forceful expression of the ever-increasing technological nightmare that threatens to de-soul Western man to the point where he is ready for the Skinnerian vision of hell on earth. What is luminously clear right now is the progressive disintegration of Western civilization's values through the general collapse of its traditional mythology, and consequently the breakdown of Western man's means of communication with his own unconscious, which he tries desperately to recapture with drug-induced trances and ecstasies. Contemporary man appears to have forgotten what Goethe stated toward the end of Faust. Reality depends entirely on symbolic significance. The true symbol being, as Goethe had described it earlier, the representation of the general through the particular, not, however, as a shadow, but as the revelation of the unfathomable in a moment filled with life. What is now happening to Western civilization, its true cultural revolution, is what has happened, time and again, to self-enclosed communities, suddenly exposed to the chilly influence of an overpowering alien culture. They fall apart when their traditional worldview is destroyed, when their myths are overthrown, their symbols exploded, their cosmologies blown to bits. In other words, when man's most precious possession, mental coherence, is shattered. This shattering of his world picture drives man to some form or other of insanity. And in the long run, having lost all will to lead a meaningless life, to suicide. Westerners have seen it happen to exotic civilizations, as well as primitive communities, for centuries. Now it is happening to their own civilization, not through the brutal intrusion of an alien culture, but through the working out to its utmost logical conclusions, the inner drive of their own culture. This drive is Promethean, the essentially one-sided masculine force of aggression, striving for endless expansion and conquest which started, in Western Europe, when the Gothic spires shot up toward the sky, the flying buttresses challenging the laws of gravity, and the stained glass windows incorporating outer space in the Gothic structure. When the conquistadors circled the globe, destroying heathen empires and grabbing whole continents, when scientific inquiry began to discover the inner mathematical structure of nature and technology, began to overpower her, given the means to do so by the Industrial Revolution. Now, like a steamroller out of control, the masculine principle in Western civilization is in that state of exacerbation characteristic of all that is about to die. All the components of a virility pushed to caricature are present in our societies: collapse of the traditional mythologies and rejection of the anima. Exasperation of the desiccating cerebral in art and literature at the expense of the emotional. Triumph of loveless and depersonalized sex in the traditionally masculine rather than feminine mode. Contentious emphasis on exaggeration, on pushing theories, artistic and literary techniques, ideologies, and every other category to the limits of the absurd. Chasing away the sacred and the holy, and stripping love from sex. All point the same way, the way symbolized by the apostles of the death of God when they substitute what they call an Orestian for the former Oedipal theology, and claim that the mother must be destroyed, the mother who represents security, warmth, religion, authority, but who has become corrupt and an evil bearer of all that she is supposed to represent. It is fitting that, in its last gasp, the patriarchally oriented, death of God Protestant ethic should all at once reject the Oedipal outlook, with its tension between father and son, and the gap between them in which woman finds her place, and move to an Erustian one where, in matricidal fashion, all that remains of the warm, unifying, and soothing feminine element still lingers in what is left of Christianity is rejected, an exacerbation of the masculine pushed to the limits of self-destruction. This is an aging, almost decrepit Prometheus in his late Protestant Puritan garb, unsteady and faltering. He is attempting to accelerate the destructive flight forward, toward ever more pointless activity, aggressiveness, and competition, trying in a last gasp to sweep the world bare of what is left of love, warmth, beauty, and security. It is Eros put to flight by Thanatos, the spirit of death. Against this, Miguel de Unamuno upheld what is left of the more feminine form of faith in the tragic sense of life. It is not rational necessity, but vital anguish that impels us to believe in God. To believe in God is to long for his existence, and further, it is to act as if he existed. It is to live by this longing, and to make it the inner spring of our action. This longing or hunger for divinity begets hope. Hope begets faith and hope beget charity. Of this divine longing is born our sense of beauty, of finality, of goodness. This is true faith, as opposed to the contemporary mania for the believing to be true. But few hear this contemporary voice from an immensely remote and almost enigmatic past. Nietzsche prophesied the inevitable doom of European culture, the collapse of all traditional values, and the triumph of nihilism, along with the triumph of the Dionysian spirit, the full acceptance, and eventually perhaps the transcending of decadence. Today, we can see and feel the decadence, but certainly not the overcoming of it. The Western Promethean drive is coming to an end, and all its components are beginning to fall apart. Quite naturally, one of its most important components, the relatively harmonious relations between the sexes, is also falling apart. Now that Prometheus' sons are faltering, Pandora's daughters revolt. Not gently, in womanly fashion as they did some generations ago, but with cold revolutionary fury in the masculine mode. Chapter 5. Pandora's Daughters. 19th century feminism died in the early 1920s. With the granting of suffrage to women in most countries in Europe and America, it died the natural death that comes with fulfillment. From today's revolutionary standpoint, however, it appears that it was not a natural death, but the result of a wave of reaction that swept through the social landscape. We got sidetracked and discovered to our astonishment that when you got the vote you were not thereby made a full-fledged citizen. It was a horrible discovery. The horrible discovery was that granting suffrage to women made no overall difference. Few women were elected to legislatures. Few were still acceded to top political office. Women's share in the liberal professions tended to shrink. They remained virtually absent from the higher echelons of business, and totally absent from the higher ranks of the increasingly influential armed forces. Even in those labor unions where women outnumber men by 3 to 1. For instance, in the American unions, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, 9 out of 10 members of the boards are men. In fact, women rarely favor the election of members of their own sex. At times, and in marginal situations, women's suffrage makes some difference in the selection of successful male politicians. Women seem to pay more attention to the candidate's personality and background than the more abstract-minded male voters who concentrate on ideas and party labels. The female vote is largely responsible for the rise of independence outside the regular party framework, favoring often the strong man in times of crisis. In the French presidential election of 1965, for instance, Charles de Gaulle was re-elected by the women while a majority of the men voted against him. Female votes are usually more conservative, against foreign commitments everywhere, more focused on practical issues and local affairs. Often, the more conservative, right-wing men favored female suffrage for this very reason. When Pope Benedict XV stated in 1919 that he favored the vote for women, he symbolized this conservative viewpoint, female suffrage as a stabilizing conservative force, which prompted the left-wing French radical socialists to stand against it. In English-speaking nations, after the first flush of feminist victory in the early 1920s, the Great Depression struck, relegating feminist claims to the background. Too much time and effort were spent merely surviving to bother about a redistribution of gender roles. The trauma of World War I reinforced this trend by giving new life, as armed conflicts always do, to the old traditional sexual stereotypes of Anglo-Saxons. The search for happiness, so arduous in the difficult decades of the 1930s and 40s, was narrowed down to the search for sexual companionship within the framework of the typical bourgeois nuclear family. Writing in the early 1950s, Margaret Mead noted with astonishment, a half-century ago, the eyes of the specially able girl who went to college faced ahead towards a profession, towards a career. The idea of marriage was often pushed aside as a handicap. Today, the girl of the same ability is usually willing to admit that she wants to marry, and seems more willing to sacrifice her career to marriage than to sacrifice a chance for marriage to her career. Success for a woman means success in finding and keeping a husband. This is much more true than it was a generation ago, in a sense. And for a while, happiness of a dull sort was achieved by many. But something had been happening below the surface, a hidden traumatic development that had begun at the turn of the century, and now lay concealed under the superficial jollity of the early post-war era. The full psychological consequences of the Industrial Revolution, and its technological sequels, began to make themselves felt in the realm of intersex relations. The Industrial Revolution had, of course, already destroyed the hoary concept of the family as a productive economic unit, but it had left it free to enjoy itself as a consuming unit. But something far more dangerous was taking place stealthily. The sexes were moving at full speed away from one another in all realms, except that of physical relations, because the ever-expanding machine had interposed itself between them. As the machine developed, expanded, and began to devour the earth, it entrapped man, its creator, into devoting increasing time and care to its sustenance. First of all, the machine had to be thought out in man's brain. As a technician, scientist, or engineer, the husband began to find it difficult to communicate with his wife about his work. Not only was it a matter of lack of scientific and mathematical education for women, it was the well-attested fact that, by and large, women are less interested in abstractions than in concrete issues, less concerned with general problems than with people. Man, however, fell in love with his abstractions. Even as a young boy, he fell in love with mechanical gadgets and would trade girls any day for his mechanical toys. Later, as a technological husband, he would find that he had little to say to his non-technological wife. The full-scale flight into ever-increasing specialization and the increasingly abstruse nature of these special fields of interest have raised the interconjugal barriers higher still, in an age of growing specialization. Increasing gender specialization became inevitable. In some ways, just as at the beginning of the prehistoric hunting way of life, a psychological and social dimorphism between the sexes appeared and began to increase at full speed. A highly specialized man's world, unknown in former non-mechanical centuries, has grown within contemporary lifestyles, made up of all the multifarious activities to which men give themselves with passion, and from which most women are rigidly excluded. A feeling of intense solitude and increasing, hopeless alienation has gripped many women since this trend started, as if males and females were living on different planets moving away from one another. Man, given to the passion of his professional endeavors, does not feel this alienation. Although he should to some extent, this new way of life is shattering whatever harmonious relations there ever were between the sexes. An increasingly technological environment is slowly destroying the former pride that both males and females found in the specific tasks of their respective sexes. It destroys the romanticism that used to pervade their relationship, the magic attached to mystery, the stimulating tension due to restraint, the dignity of both, disrupting the human sexual ecology and compelling women to attempt to metamorphose themselves into pseudo-men. Indeed, whatever B.F. Skinner may think, many Western men and women are already beyond freedom and dignity. What kind of a society advises young, ambitious business executives that the man who goes to the top has got to be slightly dissatisfied with his marriage and should be able to put his marriage in neutral when his job becomes unusually demanding? Or that the really successful executive has distressingly little time for his family, and that, if you want a full home life, You'd better be content with a lesser job. When Western man fell in love with the machine, he indeed began to alienate his soul, to dehumanize himself. As his subjective self, his inner life began to shrivel. He increasingly sought refuge in the external object, the social consequence being the rise of the consumer society. This love of the object, of the machine, became a substitute for the love and affection that should be directed at other human beings. For Western man, increasingly trapped in the steady routine of jobs, compelled to lead a sedentary life in which social ritual has programmed in advance all the synthetic values, duties, and pleasures that are his lot, the machine becomes a substitute, giving him the illusion of control and power, and worst of all, the illusion of masculinity, a masculinity he no longer displays for the benefit of the opposite sex. Just as little boys are surrounded with mechanical toys, the male adult, remaining in a state of perpetual adolescence, now surrounds himself with power tools and gadgets, identifies with them, and ends by destroying his relationship with the female sex. Carl Menninger encapsulated the problem as follows. If I were to try to express in a single word the accusation brought by wives against husbands and by children against fathers, as I have learned in my clinical experience, I should say the chief sin of men with reference to their wives and children is not harshness, not parsimony, not tyranny, or injustice or eccentricity, but passivity. Under this I should include overdependence, inattentiveness, helplessness, overmeekness, indifference, neglect. Many a wife tells a story something like this. My husband is good, kind, loyal, but he just takes me for granted. He is really not interested in me except as part of his surroundings. It seems to me I compete unsuccessfully with his business interests, his hobbies, and even with the children, although he takes little enough interest in them. Medieval man reached out for God through love for woman. Now God-like man has created the machine as God created the universe ex nihilo, hence the theology of the death of God. The Almighty is no more needed now than the eternal feminine. Woman has no part in this creation. All she is supposed to be left with is her biological function. In a narcissistic fashion, man's love and emotions are wrapped up in the machine. This unconscious deification includes human beings as well, and invests woman with all the attributes of a strictly material object. One must also keep in mind that by the middle of this century, the spread of social equalitarianism and the leveling of educational opportunities, the vastly increased number of college graduates, and the increasingly keen competition that comes with improving social equality of opportunities, putting all the onus for success or failure on the individual himself, and depriving him of the convenient alibi provided by a fatalistic acceptance of traditional social inequality, added greatly to the nervous strain of middle-class men. Inevitably, this strain was reflected back at home upon the hapless wives. Finally, in an age of increasing insect-like professional specialization, it was a foregone conclusion that sexual differentiation would be included in an increasingly complex distribution of roles. Specialization splits up knowledge in an ever greater number of watertight compartments, age groups in the professional activities, and the sexes in their allotted social tasks. To make matters worse, but part and parcel of the same trend, the post-war era saw a considerable acceleration of middle-class emigration to suburbia's psychological wastelands. In the United States, especially ever since the WASP social elite began looking down on the common immigrating herd, a proto-caste system, flexible and yet rigorous, was set up, and segregation became the general pattern. The races were segregated, and the ethnic groups and minorities isolated, despite the traditional American melting pot policy. In the land of perpetual adulation of youth and all things youthful, the age groups were segregated, since the suburban nuclear family could not encompass a three-generation tier, and justified its rigid isolation by a flight from presumably obnoxious in-laws. This, in turn, implied isolating older people in senior citizen centers, areas and cities of their own, sunny subtropical ghettos from Anarchy, where they could no longer disturb the younger generation, regardless of the dramatic loneliness inflicted on millions of oldsters. Ironically, having virtually atomized the social structure and the traditional extended kinship system, within which all age groups with their ramifications learn to live together, help, love, or hate each other, proposals are now made to undo this age segregation, which is just as harmful for the young as for the old. At the very least, we should interrelate senior citizen centers with daycare centers. An obligation of healthy senior citizens should be, without pay, to care for the next generation. How? By having them commute between Florida and Ohio. For example, it might have been simpler to retain the old kinship system and tailor business life and industry to fit the purpose. Finally, in the glorious land of suburbia, the income groups were also socially and geographically segregated from one another thanks to zoning laws and club membership requirements. Segregation not only had to be rigid, it also had to shift its caste membership along with the evolution of the husband's business and social status, regardless of the emotional harm inflicted upon his family. The wife has no choice. She can be downright dangerous if she insists on keeping close friendships with the wives of her husband's subordinates. And when the husband of a friendly couple receives a promotion, then we can no longer socialize. Even the children are affected by an unstated need to avoid children of people their father has surpassed. Yet, in the midst of this ritualized segregation caused by a typological mania, society should be as neatly structured as machinery in a plant or personnel in an office where everyone becomes a potential spare part. The worst of all was overlooked for a long time: the virtual segregation of the sexes. Not only were men keeping themselves busy in their professions and the new technological world they had carved up for themselves, at the exclusion of women, but they also retained unconsciously, from the early days of the Industrial Revolution, the idea of the idle housewife as status symbol. And this, more than half a century after Thorstein Veblen had pertinently remarked that woman is endowed with her share, which there is reason to believe is more than an even share, of the instinct of workmanship, to which futility of life or of expenditure is obnoxious. The evident futility of the middle-class suburban woman's parasitic life began to weigh intolerably. The less there was to do in the home, thanks to the absence of cumbersome relatives, the presence of new technological gadgetry, and the fact that most of what used to be performed at home was now done outside, the more they were expected to stay home, improve their housekeeping standards in terms of child raising, cleanliness, cooking, and to confine their external activities to socializing with other status symbolizing wives. And, if the husband happened to be a business executive, to be the proper corporate wife from the right social, religious, and ethnic background, respectful of the right pecking order prevailing among the wives of the other executives, capable of displaying the right social skills, ready to accept the husband's long absences for business purposes, without displaying resentment. They also had to be ready to move their home, in an age of increasing business and labor mobility, to wherever he happened to be transferred. If possible, to be without a private income, earned or unearned, of their own, which increases ambition, dependence upon, and loyalty for the firm. Keep an idyllic home free from pressures where the husband warrior could relax and recuperate under their tender care, and be ready to take a back seat, along with the children, whenever business considerations became imperative. Living, unlike most Europeans, in glass houses with extremely limited privacy, a way of life with deep historical roots, it was almost inevitable that American wives should become a prime concern of their husbands' business partners and be compelled, for the good of their husbands' careers, to kowtow to business requirements. Meanwhile, their husbands have precious little time or energy to spare to fulfill both their conjugal and parental roles. Paradoxically, more women than ever went to college in the 1950s, and less went on to a career or profession than before. Campuses and their surroundings became for them matrimonial meeting grounds, from whence they could take off in their flight into femininity, which often enough to be a flight into limbo. Soon, the greatest disease that can afflict the human being began to spread like an epidemic among housewives, taking a terrible toll and spiritually destroying those who were not quite dull enough to enjoy this objectified, parasitic, and meaningless existence, shattering boredom. From boredom to revolt is but a step, and in the 1960s, the step was taken. What, in most other lands, with stronger family feelings and ties, comes as a matter of course in a wholly natural way, full acceptance of the existence of a biological difference, along with all its social consequences, has now been put up for public discussion, especially in the United States, where tension between the sexes is greatest. In the rest of the Western world, Where new middle classes tend to adopt the American way of life, there are also shifts from the traditional kinship groups and extended families to the narrow, unstable nuclear family living in growing urban and suburban areas. Once again, the traditional psychological relationship between black people and women reasserted itself in America. That way, as long as the black male had the vote, however theoretically in the South, while women, black and white, were deprived of it, his masculine pride and sense of dignity were preserved. The adoption of female suffrage made it increasingly clear to him that his race was still the least favored group, and compounded the virtual matriarchy in which he lived, since black women were more easily employed than he was. As one historian points out, the surprising thing is that the Negro Revolt has been so long in coming, fully 4 decades after the emancipation of women. Part of the reason has been the principle of matriarchy in Negro society. Negro women, like all women, tend to conservatism and opposition to violence. In the early 1960s, however, American blacks became restless, and the civil rights movement swung into high gear. A resurgence of feminist agitation could not be far behind. The first sign of it was the rather sudden appearance of the generation gap and the revolutionary mood on college campuses. The generalized mood of women as mothers at any given time finds its echo in their children's generation. To quote again Hegel's phenomenology of mind, the frustrated wife will invariably attempt to rouse her children against their father. In the 1950s, how many American mothers felt and behaved like those many wives who feel that they are losing their husbands to the company, tend to try to turn their sons against their fathers with admonitions not to be like him. This is the ground root of true revolution, when woman, who is basically conservative, becomes so frustrated by her unsatisfactory relationship with the other sex, that, through the powerful influence of motherhood, she abandons her usual resignation and rouses one generation against another. In turn, this is easy to accomplish because what the Industrial Revolution has done in terms of separating the sexes, it has also done in separating the generations. If one looks at children in 16th or 17th century paintings, the most striking item is the fact that they dress like small adults, and that even their faces are portrayed with adult expressions, symbolic of the fact that as soon as they abandoned their swaddling clothes, they lived as grown-ups, partaking in the same chores as their parents, eating the same food, playing the same games, living in the same rooms. There was no generation gap in those days because there was no concept of a prolonged childhood and extended adolescence. Everyone lived in a narrow geographical space, and life was a continuous stream of births and deaths in which the individual, infant or adult, was but a droplet. Work was not specialized by age groups. The family was, among many other things, a cooperative economic unit in which all ages and sexes shared to the best of their ability. Even labor and amusement were not as sharply separated as they are today. All this changed with the Industrial Revolution. The life and work of adults has become increasingly complex, difficult to understand for children. What the machine did to separate the sexes, it did even more to separate the generations, so that there is an intimate correlation between the revolt of women and the generation gap, the second one feeding on the first. Only one type of society has been spared this dramatic dilemma, the Israeli kibbutz, which duplicates, in a rural setting but at a much higher technological level, the traditional lifestyle of the pre-industrial age. There, children engage as soon as possible in productive work without in any way neglecting their academic studies. They are made to feel useful from the beginning of their lives. In Western societies, studies are prolonged beyond all reasonable standards, forcing masses of young people to lead, and to know that they lead, a useless, parasitic, irrelevant existence in colleges and universities. Here again is a point of contact with the feeling of emptiness and uselessness of their largely idle status symbolizing mothers. Thanks to rising affluence in Western societies, it became possible to extend public school and college life, in terms of both time and numbers of students, through the whole of adolescence, postponing for years the start of productive work and the need to earn a living. This is poison in the body social. The male adolescents of the 1960s began to suffer from and display violently all the signs of an intense crisis of self-identity, largely the result of the unwillingness or impossibility of identifying with their fathers. The young females, on their side, became terrified at the prospect of having to duplicate their frustrated mothers' lives. The generation gap opened wide, and with it, the first stirrings of the woman's liberation movement. One of Pandora's most distinguished daughters, Simone de Beauvoir, created quite a stir in the early 1950s when she brought out the second sex and reopened the proverbial box. A true blue stocking. She produced a work far more notable for its commendable literary style than for the accuracy of her data or the soundness of her judgment. As far as she is concerned, there is no eternal feminine, only a historical one imposed by male-induced social conditioning. This thesis was neatly wrapped up in the existentialist jargon borrowed from her mentor, Jean-Paul Sartre, implicitly and explicitly. She claims that both sexes are historically guilty, man for having made an object of woman, and woman for having accepted this objectification from the start. Then, relations between the sexes have been characterized by hostility and conflict, never by communion or even cooperation. A tragic and historically unfounded view of human destiny which agrees well with the morbid existentialism of the nature-hating author of La Nausée. Sartre's hatred for nature springs from a concept of existentialism that commands man to build himself up and acquire his autonomy by conquest over his human nature. Nature-hating automatically implies female-hating, a repulsion for the very nature of femaleness. Sartre's female disciple has made hers his feelings toward nature and femaleness, and her descriptions of her sex physiological processes reek with disgust because they are natural, inasmuch as nature is related to life as expression is to meaning. He who hates nature hates life and embodies implicitly a longing for death. Denying the reality of human nature implies automatically the denial of any kind of feminine nature, which accords well and fully with Sartre's dictum that existence precedes essence. A human being is not born female or anything else, but becomes one under social pressure. It is by denying woman that we can help women to assume the status of human beings. Beauvoir has nothing but contempt for maternity contrasted with man's external creative activities, as if giving birth to new human life was not the essence of creation in the full sense of the word. This prevalent devaluation of motherhood entails, implicitly, a devaluation of life itself, a logical outcome of the masculine overemphasis on the mind and on abstract thought. Beauvoir's concept of femalehood is inseparable from Sartre's brand of existentialism. As made plain in her Ethics of Ambiguity, an existentialism derived from all the great ambiguities of life, man's desire to live but his certainty of the inevitability of death, his discovery of non-being while searching for being, his assertion of the preeminence of the subject while making the others his objects, and becoming himself an object for them. Even the freedom man prizes and glorifies turns out to be absurd because it involves freedom from everything, including the acceptance of an objective set of values which he has not elaborated himself. With Sartre, French philosophic thought reaches its nadir. Absurdity, culled from the undigested Germanisms of Marx, Heidegger and Nietzsche, takes over. Beauvoir's view of the female of the species fits perfectly in his overall scheme of absurdity. In the second sex, one can find encapsulated all the contradictions that are going to plague the new women's liberation doctrine. Affirm that nothing is natural but only social, yet be compelled to accept the overpowering impact of the reality of physiology. Assert yet deny some kind of anatomic destiny. Accept that the given situation depends on physiology, and yet claim simultaneously that physiology depends on the situation. Deny the female's inherent passivity, but accept it in all sexual matters. Refuse to accept that woman's personality is affected by endocrine secretions, yet accept their interrelatedness. Demand that the sexes be neutralized, and in the same breath, assert that this is impossible. Never mind. Often woman varies. She steamrolls on, undeterred by contradictions and inconsistencies, toward her main goal. The famous difference does not exist generically. Woman and femininity must be denied. By and large, within the general context of a cultural exacerbation of the one-sided masculine, this is the position on which the forthcoming extremists of the liberation movement are going to take their stand. In a world in the throes of a multiplicity of simultaneous revolutions on different levels, the difference is to be repudiated, since it is a social monstrosity perpetrated by the males. The complementarity of the sexes is hogwash, and so is the cooperation based on it. Childbearing is almost demeaning. All that derives from the difference, social institutions, the state, marriage, family, sexual restraints, traditions, must go by the board. And with the world stripped bare of all its former structures, the happy dream of anarchy can at last come true. Power and hierarchy will be destroyed. The similarities between the atmosphere of the contemporary Western world and that of the Roman Empire in the throes of decadence are startling. The same loss of true religious faith and ethical purpose, the same cultural degeneracy and lack of creativity, the same brutalization and cult of purposeless violence. The Roman circus, in which gladiators shed their blood for the sadistic satisfaction of the crowds, is now replaced by the ubiquitous cinema and television screens. And the blood formerly shed on the sand of the circus has become the ketchup splashed on our screens for a contemporary sophisticated type of psychopathic crowd. But the psychological significance is identical in both instances. Even the rebellion of women in both civilizations has identical connotations and portends the same ultimate destruction for both societies. Because in both instances, woman revolts within the masculine framework instead of displaying a creatively feminine approach to the fundamental problem of how to restore woman's power and influence without destroying society, how to give the feminine component of our collective being its due place. Instead, the woman's liberation movement looks forward to achieving complete equality with man in the political, social, and economic fields without regard to retrieving not only women's fast-fading femininity, but womanly values, which have almost completely disappeared from our exclusively male-oriented Western society. Their liberation resembles the attempt of artists engaged in interior decorating while the building's foundations are crumbling. What did it avail the liberated women of Rome when Alaric's Visigothic hordes swept through the city, sacking it and raping them, instead of countering the male tendency to aggress and dislocate? The liberation movement makes it their own, and aims at the destruction of all the cultural values and social institutions that have traditionally protected women. As Margaret Mead states in reference to a primitive community, this Manus example is very instructive, because it represents a case where women do not enjoy being women. Not because public rewards given males are denied to them, but because the sensuous creative significance of the female role of wife and mother is so undervalued. When all achievement is outside the home, women of enterprise and initiative hate to be told that they must confine themselves there, but when the home itself is undervalued, then also women will cease to enjoy being women, and men will neither envy nor value the female role. As with the Manus, so with the Westerners. It is true that the Western social structure has been grievously defective in idling a large portion of its middle-class woman power as an industrialist deactivates his obsolete machinery. Women should be, as they always were in the past, the flywheels of economic production. What Western women have been longing for quite naturally is not an innovation, but to regain the position of economic productivity and the sense of social usefulness they had lost when the center of production moved from the home to the factory. In fact, they were not striving for a new thing, but for the restitution of their lost share in the scheme of economic affairs. To complicate matters further, female life expectancy is so much greater today than it was a few generations ago, that the women of today have not only one but two adult lives to dispose of. The Western woman could hardly make full use of one life. What is she to do with two? In his utter concentration on his Faustian destiny, Western man has forgotten that woman is not only a status symbol and a convenience or inconvenience, but also a specific human value. It is entirely his own fault if this specificity has become lost, and if woman finds herself unable or unwilling to retrieve it. Yet, if she does not, there is no future for Western society as we know it. Nothing illustrates more poignantly the implicit contempt for and anger at femalehood in America than the celebrated attack on momism by Philip Willey, some decades ago in his Generation of Vipers. Mom is the end product of she, he proclaimed. Mom is an American creation. Her elaboration was necessary because she was launched as Cinderella. Then, true enough, in compensation for her deactivation as a piece of obsolete social machinery in the economically productive sector of American life, she was granted several privileges. She became the all-consumer and set the pace and tastes of consumption. Being longer lived than the male, she came to own well over half of the nation's wealth, and as a salve for her wounded dignity as economically unproductive, her motherhood was exalted, whereas elsewhere, motherhood comes as much as a matter of course as crops and the weather, good or bad. At times, this condition of privilege granted to compensate for having become a status symbol maintained a precarious social equilibrium between the sexes. But it was all make-believe on the part of the men, still resentful of being tied to mom's apron strings as youngsters, and later contemptuous, in their heart of hearts, of femaleness. Philip Wiley articulated this mixture of contempt and resentment with drastic eloquence. I give you Mom. I give you the destroying mother. I give you her justice, from which we have never removed the eye bandage. I give you the angel, and point to the sword in her hand. Bernard. Oh wow! We must face the dynasty of the dames at once. Deprive them of our pocketbooks when they waste the substance in them, and take back our dreams which, without the perfidious materialism of Mom, were shaping up a new and braver world. Act. Our society is too much an institution built to appease the rapacity of loving mothers. Oh, what are all? Never before has a great nation of brave and dreaming men absent-mindedly created a huge class of idle, middle-aged women. Obviously. But having created this huge class of idle women, Wiley then sought to strip away the one consolation that soothed their offended dignity without offering them anything in return. This is precisely the condition against which the next generation of women, the present one, decided to rebel. However, the road back from socioeconomic obsolescence is not an easy one, as the feminine reaction against the Amendment on Equal Rights suggests. One of the most articulate female opponents of this legal abolition of all forms of sex discrimination has pointed out that equal rights would be a step down for women, who already have the status of special privilege. Such privileges many women want to keep and preserve. The right not to take a job and the tradition that awards children to the mother in divorce cases, along with extremely substantial alimonies from the male partner. In a nutshell, many contemporary women would like to have their cake and eat it too, share with the men the status, power, and privileges that they apparently enjoy in social and professional life, while keeping all the special privileges that were allotted to women as compensation for having been virtually idled by the machine. This, of course, will never come to pass. Beyond the technical problem, involving some socioeconomic restructuring of allowing women full scope for the use of their natural talents, including if need be a compulsive numerus clausus in political institutions, without harming their offspring or antagonizing their male partners, at a much deeper level, the basic problem lies in changing Western man's one-sided virile outlook. Discarding those patriarchal values that now, pushed to an extreme, undermine his society's foundations. This would require an entirely new breed of women who could see beyond the mere, and largely futile, struggle for equality, which, in reality, is a struggle for sameness. They would have to discard the artificial femininity foisted upon their sex after the Industrial Revolution and retrieve the deeper values of womanliness. They would also have to put a brake on the cult of an artificial masculinity and enhance the more stabilizing characteristics of femaleness. In other words, let the frustrated anima of our society enjoy free scope to project itself, even if it implies a profound reorientation of our social goals. The basically androgynous nature of all human beings implies that, whether male or female, they must periodically alternate their modes of being, shifting from the masculine to the feminine style, and back again. Any effort to suppress one of the elements of bisexuality can only cause psychic trauma. If this is true within the individual, it is even more true within the social organism. The contemporary revolutionary mood is rooted in the present psychic distortion of the Western soul. It is the revenge of the frustrated anima. A spontaneous, unplanned, uncoordinated revolt, which does not understand itself and persists in remaining within the confines of male-oriented values instead of breaking out of them. In essence, it is a rebellion against the superficial effects rather than the root cause, hence, doomed to failure. Contemporary eroticism attempts to free women sexually, but according to a masculine conception of sexuality. Shifting the purpose of sexual activity from procreation to recreation symbolizes this decadent emphasis on an exclusively masculine mode of being. The present rehabilitation of the erotic in its purely sexual, loveless aspect is completely at variance with the truly feminine conception. Even the prophets of the New Left fall into this error, followed by hordes of deluded females, unable to free themselves from the shackles of the ancestral patriarchal outlook. Freud correctly assimilated the purely sexual, loveless erotic with the desire for release, and consequently, with an ultimate striving toward dislocation, destruction, and death, thanatos, as against eros, the love-filled erotic, unifying, and conservationist. Libidinous energy can overcome its built-in self-destructiveness only by focusing on an external being. On the other, by overcoming its tendency toward deadly narcissism. Ultimately, this overemphasis of the masculine component in Western society threatens to destroy its foundations. As one psychologist states it, contemporary women are often afraid to be considered mere women, while men are often terrified that their maleness will be judged insufficient, a vicious circle of pseudo-virilism out of which it is difficult, but essential, to emerge. There can be no salvation in the new revolutionary movements, all of which represent, almost by revolutionary definition, the exacerbation to the point of caricature of the masculine outlook at its most destructive. The humorless women's liberation movement leads nowhere either because it does not even attempt to break the fetters of the all-powerful male outlook. Rather, it wraps them more tightly around itself and compounds its social destructiveness. All it really does is contribute further to the self-dislocating Promethean drive by the blind fanaticism of many of its members and their uncompromising determination to become their own lunatic fringe. Western women's only real hope, as it has been throughout history, is to change the male-manufactured, feminine identity to which they seem to object, by using their motherhood effectively and influencing their offspring, developing in their children what they consider to be the desirable attitude in the matter. This should be all the easier since mothers face little masculine competition in the child-raising business, the father having become almost vestigial in middle-class society, the actual, overprotecting, oppressive mother, doubling up as surrogate father, producing infantile sons because she has nothing better to do, and becoming a tyrant in the home must disappear. In a sense, the strange paradox is that while the power structure of Western society remains entirely in the hands of men, the latter have lost all power in the home, and therefore all influence over the next generation, a fundamental imbalance that must be redressed. All this presupposes, of course, that the family is not to be destroyed, that, as the experience of the Israeli kibbutzim has demonstrated, the family simply cannot be destroyed without wrecking society altogether. The liberation's lunatic fringe, starting with Beauvoir, wants to do away with it altogether. But the solution of the problem raised by the nuclear family's deficiencies does not lie in its dissolution, but in overcoming its narrowness and its selfish shrinking of effective life by reintegrating it in a larger organic whole, some form of extended family that can generate far greater human warmth than is possible within the restricted confines of the nuclear group. As usual, the greatest victims are the children, next to be liberated from any kind of compulsion, discipline, hierarchy, tradition, parental authority, sexual restraint, learning, and education. What, unfortunately, they have been liberated from is parental concern and affection, just as their fathers and mothers are actually liberating themselves from deep concern for each other. Western middle-class life, with its work patterns, social obligations, and housing facilities, allows little adult time to be devoted to children. In turn, the latter are condemned to live largely with their peer groups, suffering in fact from age segregation as much as the oldsters. It is striking to see how much more time and concern are devoted to children by parents in Israeli kibbutzim, or even in Soviet Russia or Red China, where lack of housing space throws everyone together and social activities integrate, rather than segregate sexes and age groups. The whole style of Western living, made possible by affluence, town planning, architecture, commuting, seems to be designed for the express purpose of isolating children's activities from those of their parents. A certain selfishness and dryness of heart is now afflicting a large part of Western society, which is well reflected in the contemporary cultural output. This affliction is at the root of the so-called permissiveness, which is nothing but the inevitable consequence of indifference, lack of concern, and a low level of effectivity. Children are to be let loose in an exclusively materialistic universe, devoid of cosmic meaning. A vacuous nirvana in which they will truly become liberated through spiritual evaporation. Chapter 6. The End of the Iron Age. The disintegration of Western culture. By itself, does not mean the end of the world. The human race can still live on and prosper under new ideals and values. However, what is ending with Western culture is a 5,000-year historical cycle that started at the end of the Bronze Age with the Patriarchal Revolution. The reason for this is clear: the far-reaching consequences of the technological revolution. The end of Western culture's life course is coinciding with the end of all other separate cultures. The end of the Iron Age and, hopefully, the establishment of a global humankind-wide civilization. A major component of this profound change in human conditions is the biological revolution. As scientific investigation gets closer to the biological roots of life, the possibilities of a new biological technology emerge. This includes integrating living tissue with machinery, injecting biological life into lifeless machines, merging parts of human beings with artificial mechanisms, altering their genetic inheritance, and changing the human body entirely. There seems to be no limit, except ethical ones, to the potential for physiological and embryological engineering. Researchers at Cambridge University have been able to fertilize human eggs outside the body, growing the resulting embryo up to the blastocyst stage when it normally attaches itself to the uterine wall. The potential for genetic engineering is startling. This includes deletion or insertion of genes through microsurgery, using lasers or X-rays to beam through DNA molecules and slice them as required, or introducing specific molecules into the DNA chain. The potential for modifying the complex information in the genes with the help of specific viruses, enzymes that copy genetic material, nuclear graft, or simply taking a DNA chain from one egg and injecting it into another to fertilize it, is already at hand. In the latter case, it would enable a woman to fertilize herself without any male assistance. It seems clear that, within a generation or two, it will be possible to program cells with synthesized information. Perhaps the most terrifying prospect lies in cloning, a form of reproduction by division of a body cell rather than fusion or conjugation of two sex cells, resulting in genetically identical carbon copies of the single parent who donates the body cell. Even if a woman were still required to provide the uterine environment and the egg cell cytoplasm for the development of the fetus, she would not be the biological mother of the child, but merely an empty vessel, as imagined by the Greeks of Periclean times. Cloning can use a female body cell just as well as a male one, producing a child without a biological father. From there to doing away with the need for a female womb altogether is but a step. Babies could be conceived and nurtured entirely outside any woman's uterus. The political, social, and ethical implications, not to mention the psychological and emotional ones, of the biological revolution are staggering. What the political, economic, social, and cultural revolutions cannot achieve, changing in depth and scope the present relations between the sexes, may perhaps be achieved by the biological revolution, which is in the process of freeing woman from her natural limitations. By exorcising the threat of unwanted pregnancies, regulating or eliminating the menstrual cycle, and radically separating the sexual act from procreation, it could ultimately destroy all the shackles that bound woman to nature and the lunar cycle. Hormonal injections and genetic engineering could further alter her strictly female characteristics and bring her closer to the masculine type. The trend toward homogenized androgyny in contemporary Western societies is clearly in evidence, and could undoubtedly lead to the creation of an insect-like third sex through hormone implantations in the early stages of pregnancy, just about the time when the male or female neural circuits are in the process of being activated, masculinizing a female fetus, or vice versa. With this, the Iron Age will truly come to a close. There is already plenty of evidence that, quite apart from short and long-term physiological considerations, the biological revolution is having a profound psychological impact on younger women, and, mutatis mutandis, could well be the contemporary equivalent of man's discovery of his biological paternity eons ago. Some ardent liberationists claim that as soon as woman has mastered her procreative functions, the future of the world is hers. Is it? aside from the still largely unknown long-term physiological consequences of such a state of affairs. It is clear that such innovations as the biological revolution can cut both ways. All these developments, fruits of man's mental cogitations, are in the hands of males, not females. Nevertheless, psychologically exhilarated by this new physiological freedom and closer to the masculine model, the woman of the future may well decide to challenge man on what he considers his own grounds, forgetting that all the elements of power, except that of motherhood, are in his hands, not hers. Her masculinization would undoubtedly aggravate him far more than her present challenge. Any large-scale threat to man's self-imposed concept of his masculinity could trigger a countermove, a violent reaction that would aim at relocating the female of the species where the male thinks she belongs. The recent rise of sexual impotence among young American males, for instance, could do it if it threatened to become a permanent feature. A report published in the early 1970s in the Archives of General Psychiatry blames this alarming rise on the fact that newly freed women demand sexual performance, in a reversal of former roles. What is important in this respect is the possible collision between new socio-sexual mores and the inescapable biological and psychological realities of the present. Patterns of sex recognition and attraction cannot be overthrown or discarded overnight and always vary from one sex to the other. Every species has a pattern of sex recognition that is deeply rooted, and the usual pattern combines sex drive and aggressiveness in the male, sex receptivity and submission in the female. Any tampering with these patterns can mean disaster for the survival of the social group concerned. It could well happen that an angry male backlash would use genetic engineering and hormonal treatment for the opposite purpose, to refeminize human females rather than masculinize them. It can work both ways. The idea that men would willingly let women challenge them on their own grounds can only germinate in an unwarrantedly optimistic view of human nature as it really is. Beyond the male-female relationship, this raises an even graver issue, the problem of the freedom of biological research in the future, which may well be curtailed by international agreement as being more dangerous than the entire nuclear arsenal on this earth. For instance, referring to the problem of test tube babies and the artificial growth of human embryos outside a maternal womb, molecular biologist James Watson, of double helix fame, testified before the House Subcommittee on Science in Washington, advocating the prohibition of any kind of research on human embryos and cell fusion. In 1972, the American Medical Association called for a moratorium on experiments on cloning and the implantation of embryos in women's wombs, stating that representatives of various disciplines should be assembled to discuss once again the thorny issues raised by the genetic engineers. At some point in the future, the profound conservatism of the human race, embodied in the great majority of its females, is likely to reassert itself under the science-born threat of total dehumanization. Genetic engineering. Like nuclear experiments for military purposes, may come to a dead stop by universal agreement. Recoiling in horror before the prospects, man will call a halt to the accumulation of fatally dangerous knowledge. Heeding Nietzsche's advice, man ought not to know more of a thing than he can creatively live up to. Or, as Konrad Lorenz put it is the unripe fruit of the tree of knowledge that proves to be dangerous. What is evident is that the trend toward a drastic reduction in the sexual difference and the drive toward the unisexual, far from being progressive, is essentially regressive. This has proved to be true in evolution since sexual differentiation started at the unicellular level. Margaret Mead states it succinctly. Every adjustment that minimizes a difference, vulnerability in one sex, a differential strength in the other, diminishes their possibility of complementing each other, and corresponds, symbolically, to sealing off the constructive receptivity of the female and the vigorous outgoing constructive activity of the male, muting them both in the end to a duller version of human life, in which each is denied the fullness of humanity that each might have had. It is the sublimation of the sexual urge that has brought mankind to its present level of knowledge and self-consciousness, created the cultures we enjoy, and brought us closer to understanding the mysteries of cosmic creation. To cut off this urge and this sublimation is suicidal, while the new freedom conferred on woman is all to the good, since it enhances true femininity by making it a free choice rather than an imposed obligation. The present drive toward a neutralization of the sexes, by shrinking the difference and the creative tension between them, denotes a social death wish. This is implicit in the depreciation of motherhood that is becoming so prevalent and is, again, too easily justified by the threat of a global population explosion. The greatest error made by Western man since the days of Aristotle, repeated and emphasized by Thomas Aquinas and many others, is precisely to slur over the difference, and mistakenly see woman as a defective, incomplete, lower-grade male who lacks something, a defective man. This mistake was never made in civilizations, such as the Indian and the Chinese, where the difference never implied ultimate superiority or inferiority. If Western woman now attempts to become a pseudo-male, it is largely because Western man invented this concept long ago, instead of granting female specificity the full recognition and respect it deserves, a result of an overvaluation of cerebral creation at the expense of the physiological maternal creativity that gave birth to man. As a result, female liberationists are only too prone to assert that after a long period of celebrating the differences between men and women, we are heading into an androgynous world. But, if this is the case, it is only Western civilization that is heading in that deadly direction. Decrease in differentiation is devitalizing and would threaten Western society with biological extinction. The burden of the Promethean drive will have spiritually exhausted its civilization by depriving it of any further reason to live. The sons of Prometheus will simply have forgotten that. Just as man lives and woman is lived, just as man attempts to control destiny and the future, woman is destiny and the future. Men make history. Pandora's daughters are history.